Dear colleagues, let's start our session. On January 2024, at the opening of the first part session of the Parliamentary Assembly, the still unratified credentials of the German parliamentary delegation were challenged on procedural ground in accordance with Rule 7.1b of the Assembly's Rule of Procedure, namely on the grounds that the composition of the delegation did not allow fair representation of the political party or groups of the German Bundestag. The Committee on Rules of Procedure, Immunities and Institutional Affairs has examined the various objections raised and has established that the German delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly was appointed in compliance with Articles 25 and 26 of the Statutes of the Council of Europe and Rule 6.2a of the Assembly's Rules of Procedure. Consequently, the Committee concludes that the credentials of the German parliamentary delegation should be ratified. Dear colleagues, this afternoon the agenda calls for the election of the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights. They are elected for a term of 6 years, not extendable. The list of candidates and biographical notices are to be found in document 15870, and an opinion from the Committee on Legal Affairs and the Human Rights is document 15885, addendum 2. The agenda also calls for the election of 3 judges to the European Court of Human Rights in respect of Bulgaria, Lithuania, and Luxembourg. The list of candidates and biographical notices are to be found in documents 15867, 15877, and 15876, and an opinion from the Committee on the Election of Judges to the European Court of Human Rights in document 15885, addendum 3. The voting will take place in the foyer in front of the hemicycle by secret ballot. The votes will be open from 2:30 p.m. to 6 p.m. Each political group has appointed a teller according to the rules. The tellers are Madame Marietta Karamanli, Mr. Andrea Ender Gitz-Thaler, Mr. Kamal Jafarov, Mrs. Sonia Khajarian, and Mrs. Laura Castel. I would like to remind them that they will have to be in the room set aside for this purpose at 6 p.m. The result of the vote will be announced, if possible, before the close of today's sitting. For these first ballots, an absolute majority of the votes is required. If a second round has to be organized, it will take place tomorrow afternoon. I now declare the ballots open, and in the meantime, we continue our work. We will now hear an address by His Excellency, Mr. Nikos Christodoulides, President of the Republic of Cyprus. After his address, Mr. Christodoulides will take questions from the floor.
Son Excellence, Monsieur Nikos Christodoulides, Président de la République de Chypre.
We have to be patient, dear colleagues, especially this week.
Son Excellence, M. Nikos Christodoulides, président de la République de Chypre.
Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to now welcome among us in this hemicycle His Excellency Mr. Nikos Christodoulides, President of the Republic of Cyprus. Mr. President, you declared last year at the fourth summit of the Head of States and Government of the Council of Europe that the Reykjavik Declaration will renew our commitment to the fundamental principles and values of the Council of Europe and demonstrate our resolve to assist the Council in its crucial role of effectively responding to current and future challenges. Your country, Cyprus, has been and remained an important partner of the Assembly, a partnership that started with its accession to the Council of Europe on the 24th of May 1961, less than 1 year after your country gained its independence. Representatives of your National Assembly contribute in a constructive and useful way to debates and other activities of our Assembly, thus helping to promote fundamental rights, democracy and the rule of law in Cyprus, in Europe and beyond. One of my predecessors in the post of President of the Assembly was a remarkable Cypriot politician, Mrs. Stella Kyriakides. She presided over our Assembly at a most challenging moment and is still remembered for her skill, kindness and wisdom. I also wish to thank the Republic of Cyprus for its commitment to the principles of our organization, which is also clearly manifested in your support to our actions aimed to address the consequences of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, particularly those aimed at restoring peace and justice. The Republic of Cyprus is indeed a founding member of the Registry of Damage established by the Council of Europe, the first international legal mechanism that should ensure accountability for the crimes committed by the Russian Federation in and against Ukraine since the 24th of February 2022. Mr. President, Your Excellency, I have the honor to give you the floor.
Αξιότιμε κύριε Πρόεδρε, φίλε Θοδωρή Ρουσόπουλε, θα ήθελα καταρχάς να σας συγχαρώ για την εκλογή σας στην Προεδρία της Κοινοβουλευτικής Συνέλευσης του Συμβουλίου της Ευρώπης και να σας ευχηθώ κάθε επιτυχία στην πολύ δύσκολη αποστολή σας. Η μακρά και παραγωγική πολιτική αλλά και επαγγελματική σας εμπειρία στην ευρωπαϊκή αλλά και στην ελληνική πολιτική σκηνή αποτελεί αναμφίβολα το καλύτερο εχέγγυο για μια πετυχημένη θητεία. Αγαπητέ απερχόμενε Πρόεδρε, φίλε Nikos, ευχαριστώ θερμά για την ευγενική, την πολύ τιμητική πρόσκληση που μου απέφθινες κατά την επίσκεψη σου στην Κύπρο τον περασμένο Ιούλιο να προσφωνήσω την Κοινοβουλευτική Συνέλευση, δίνοντας μου τη μοναδική ευκαιρία να βρίσκομαι σήμερα εδώ. Κύριε Πρόεδρε, κυρία Γενική Γραμματέα του Συμβουλίου της Ευρώπης, αξιότιμα μέλη της Κοινοβουλευτικής Συνέλευσης, πρέσβεις, κυρίες και κύριοι, διακατέχομαι σήμερα από αισθήματα τιμής αλλά και ευθύνης. Τιμής γιατί σε λιγότερο από ένα χρόνο από την εκλογή μου στην Προεδρία της Κυπριακής Δημοκρατίας έχω σήμερα το προνόμιο να απευθυνθώ στην Κοινοβουλευτική Συνέλευση του Συμβουλίου της Ευρώπης. Αίσθημα ευθύνης γιατί ως πρόεδρος ενός μικρού ημικατεχόμενου κράτους έχω το καθήκον και την υποχρέωση να συμπαρατάσσω με ακλόνητος μαζί με όσους στηρίζουν ουσιαστικά και με πράξεις το Συμβούλιο της Ευρώπης, ένα θεσμό άμεσα συνυφασμένο με την προάσπιση των ανθρωπίνων δικαιωμάτων και την εδραίωση της δημοκρατίας και του κράτους δικαίου στην Ευρώπη, αλλά και πέραν αυτής. Την ίδια στιγμή βρίσκομαι σήμερα εδώ για να υπογραμμίσω με τον πιο εμφαντικό τρόπο την απόλυτη ανάγκη προστασίας και περαιτέρω προώθησης της πολυμέρειας, γιατί έχω την έντονη πεποίθηση ότι είναι το μοναδικό μέσο που έχουμε στη διάθεσή μας για διεκδίκηση και διασφάλιση των αρχών και αξιών που πρεσβεύει το Συμβούλιο της Ευρώπης και η κοινοβουλευτική του συνέλευση, αλλά και για την αντιμετώπιση των σημερινών πολλαπλών προκλήσεων. Κυρίες και κύριοι, το Συμβούλιο της Ευρώπης αποτελεί αναπόσπαστο μέρος του φιλόδοξου οράματος των προτεργατών της Ευρωπαϊκής Ενοποίησης. Αφυπνισμένοι από την φρίκη των δύο μεγάλων παγκόσμιων πολέμων και αποφασισμένοι να επουλώσουν τις πληγές του παρελθόντος, προχώρησαν αποφασιστικά για τη δημιουργία μιας Ευρώπης στην οποία να κυριαρχεί η ελευθερία και το κράτος δικαίου. Και ακριβώς μέσα από αυτή την πολιτική προσέγγιση, μέσα από αυτή τη θεώρηση, το Συμβούλιο της Ευρώπης έχει καταστεί ένας εκ των σημαντικότερων διακυβερνητικών οργανισμών και βρίσκεται στην πρώτη γραμμή της προώθησης και της προστασίας των ανθρωπίνων δικαιωμάτων, της δημοκρατίας και του κράτους δικαίου. Η ιστορική πόλη του Στρασβούργου, το Συμβούλιο της Ευρώπης και ο εμβληματικός χώρος που φιλοξενούμαστε σήμερα είναι γνώριμα τόσο σε μένα προσωπικά, όσο και στους πλήστους συμπατριώτες μου, γιατί ανάμεσα σε πολλά άλλα είναι αναπόσπαστα στοιχεία της συνεχούς κοινής μας προσπάθειας για περαιτέρω ευρωπαϊκή ενοποίηση, της ακατάπαυστης επιδίωξής μας για συνεργασία, αλλά και προάσπιση βασικών πανανθρώπινων αρχών και δικαιωμάτων, που δυστυχώς μέχρι και σήμερα, σε κάποιες των περιπτώσεων, δεν είναι δεδομένες. Όπως πολύ καλά γνωρίζετε, στη δική μου πατρίδα, στην Κύπρο, τα τελευταία 50 χρόνια βιώνουμε τις τραγικές συνέπειες της παραβίασης βασικών ανθρωπίνων δικαιωμάτων και ελευθεριών. 50 χρόνια μετά την βάρβαρη τουρκική εισβολή του 1974, στην Ευρωπαϊκή Κύπρο υπάρχει κατοχή, εκτοπισμένη, αγνοούμενη, εγκλωβισμένη. Αξιότιμα μέλη, δυστυχώς για ακόμα μια φορά σε ευρωπαϊκό και διεθνές επίπεδο διάγουμε μια περίοδο πολλαπλών και πολυεπίπεδων προκλήσεων που δεν γνωρίζουν σύνορα ή εθνότητες. Απειλές κατά των ανθρωπίνων δικαιωμάτων, της ειρήνης, της δημοκρατίας και του πλουραλισμού, κλιματική κρίση, αύξηση μεταναστευτικών και προσφυγικών ροών, τρομοκρατία, θρησκευτικός φονταμενταλισμός, ανθρωπιστική και επιστημιστική κρίση είναι μόνο μερικές από τις κρίσεις που καλούμαστε σήμερα να αντιμετωπίσουμε. Σε αυτές, και αν θέλετε ως συνέπεια των προκλήσεων που προανέφερα, ο ρόλος και η σημασία της πολυμέρειας, του διαλόγου, της ειρηνικής επίλυσης διαφορών βρίσκονται υπό αμφισβήτηση. Μέσα σε αυτό το πλαίσιο, ο ρόλος του Συμβουλίου της Ευρώπης, της κοινοβουλευτικής του συνέλευσης, ο ρόλος όλων εσάς καθίσταται ακόμα πιο σημαντικός. Έχω, κυρίες και κύριοι, την έντονη πεποίθηση πως η καλύτερη, η πιο αποτελεσματική απάντηση στις σημερινές προκλήσεις και απειλές κατά της πολυμέρειας είναι η διεύρυνση και η ενίσχυσή της μέσω της περαιτέρω και πιο ουσιαστικής συνεργασίας των δημοκρατικών χωρών και εκείνων των διακυβερνητικών οργανισμών που πρεσβεύουν τις αξίες αυτές. Αυτό πιστεύω πως είναι το μοναδικό μέσο που έχουν τα κράτη στη διάθεσή τους, που έχουμε στη διάθεσή μας για προάσπιση της ειρήνης, της ασφάλειας και της ευημερίας στην Ευρωπαϊκή Ήπειρο. Οδηγός μας σε αυτή την προσπάθεια πρέπει να είναι το κοινό μας όραμα για το μέλλον που επιθυμούμε να έχουμε, για εμάς, για τους συμπολίτες μας και πιο σημαντικό απ' όλα, για τα παιδιά μας και τις επόμενες γενιές. Σε αυτή την προσπάθεια, φίλες και φίλοι, προεξάρχοντο ρόλο αναμφίβολα επιτελείτε και όλοι εσείς, τα μέλη της Κοινοβουλευτικής Συνέλευσης του Συμβουλίου της Ευρώπης. Εδώ προωθείται στην πράξη, με έργα και όχι με λόγια, ο δημοκρατικός διάλογος μεταξύ των εκλεγμένων αντιπροσώπων των 46 μελών του Συμβουλίου της Ευρώπης, καθιστώντας αυτό τον ναό της δημοκρατίας μια αναντικατάστατη γέφυρα διαβούλευσης και συνεργασίας μεταξύ των λαών της Ευρώπης. Ladies and gentlemen, the vision of peace, pluralistic democracy, respect for human rights and the rule of law that led to the establishment of the Council of Europe has never been more pertinent. We are witnessing a growing attempted erosion of rules-based international order, rising nationalism, violation of human rights, including the freedom of expression, the right to education, and religious rights. In the area of gender equality, following decades of steady progress, and backlash against women's rights has emerged, resulting in further persisting inequalities. At the same time, violence against women in all its forms is rising, while sexual health and reproductive rights of women are also being increasingly infringed upon. Furthermore, social inequality is growing and must be addressed to mitigate the consequences of current social and economic challenges. Let me be clear and underline once more, there can be no complacency on protecting and upholding freedom and human rights in Europe. The Council of Europe's leadership is crucial in preventing these violations, as safeguarding inter alia, gender equality, women's rights, the right to education, and social equality. This should always be at the core of its policy priorities, using the legally binding tools at its disposal, such as the European Social Charter, the Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, the European Cultural Convention, and crucially, the European Convention on Human Rights and its protocols. The European Court of Human Rights is an indispensable shield of our fight to uphold human rights, rule of law, and democracy. As a prime body of overseeing convention compliance, the Court is playing a catalytic role through judgment in this regard. It stands as a sacred guardian of human rights in our continent, supporting our democracies and enhancing governance. In this regard, states have a collective and unconditional obligation to fully adhere and implement the Court's final judgments. Full and non-discriminatory implementation of all judgments of the European Court of Human Rights is an essential component of our efforts. Systematic non-compliance with the Court's judgments poses a serious threat to the Court's authority, the Convention's effectiveness, and the Council's credibility, and by extension, to the rule of law, democracy, and human rights. It is deeply regrettable, ladies and gentlemen, that a large number of the Court's judgment on human rights violations are still not implemented in full, or even not at all, due to the lack of political will. One such judgment is the fourth interstate case, Cyprus versus Turkey, in which Ankara, as with many other cases, has failed today to comply. Mr. President, esteemed members of the Parliamentary Assembly, ladies and gentlemen, from the ruins and darkness of World War II grew a glimmer of hope and light. Multilateralism became the driver for peace, and the Council of Europe, as well as the United Nations and the European Union, rose as vehicles and catalysts of cooperation and of upholding common values so that the world would never again relive the horrors of war that ravaged Europe and beyond. Despite the progress achieved, 70 years since the establishment of the Council of Europe, multilateralism is facing dire challenges. Yet again, in Europe and beyond, we are witnessing suffering from terrifying wars and horrendous atrocities. In Europe, the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine demonstrated that peace in Europe, and indeed in the world, can never be taken for granted. From the outset of the war, Cyprus condemned Russian aggression towards Ukraine, which has led to some 10 million Ukrainians displaced and refugees. From the very beginning, Cyprus has stood in unwavering solidarity with Ukraine and its people. We reiterate our unequivocal support to Ukraine's unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. And in doing so, ladies and gentlemen, we stand on the right side of history. We ought to be unequivocal in our message. We will never allow border changes stemming from violence and war. It is a matter of principle, of upholding international legality and the core tenets of the UN Charter. The threats to Europe and the world will not be deterred if we do not act decisively and in unity. It is our collective responsibility to uphold, no matter the cost, international legality. Diplomacy is key to this end. We need to focus our attention on ending the hostilities and ensuring lasting peace in Ukraine based on the principles of international law and the UN Charter. Ladies and gentlemen, it is becoming painfully evident that there are no frozen conflicts and that in the absence of viable, comprehensive solution, the risk of eruption of conflict with far-reaching consequences is real. The current war in the Middle East, Cyprus and Europe's immediate region proves this point. The unfolding war is a litmus test for us all, not only for regional stability, but for peace and security on a global scale. From the very beginning, we have condemned Hamas' heinous terrorist attacks on October 7, which led to the resurgence of the current cycle of violence. Terrorism is a threat to all of us. At the same time, we should be clear that Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people nor the Palestinian cause. While the drama of the hostages continue, we firmly believe that the unconditional and immediate release of all the hostages is key to ending the crisis. At the same time, while fully acknowledging Israel's right to self-defense in line with international law, including international humanitarian law, I emphasize in the strongest terms that all civilians and civilian infrastructures must be fully protected. A tragedy with far-reaching effects is evolving, and we mourn the loss of life of so many people. Our priority must continue to be the protection and the end of the suffering of so many innocent lives. And the only way forward is ensuring that there is a peace lifeline that emerges out of this war, and that means reviving the Middle East peace process on the basis of a two-state solution as reflected in the UN resolutions. In doing so, the European Union, together with like-minded partners such as the UK and the United States, as well as our Arab regional partners, must be a core part of such a strategic discussion on the basis of the Peace Day initiative. I truly believe that this is the only guarantee for ensuring conditions of lasting peace, security and dignity equally for Israelis and Palestinians alike, as well as preventing a wider multi-front spillover. At the same time, given the tremendous humanitarian needs of Gaza, Cyprus, the closest EU member state in the region with excellent relations with all neighboring countries, has put forward a comprehensive initiative for a one-way maritime corridor, the Amalthea Plan. The Cyprus Maritime Corridor Initiative provides for a complementary route to existing and future routes for humanitarian assistance to be delivered for the civilians in Gaza, and I'm very pleased that we have recently set the corridor in motion. It remains at the disposal of the international community for contributing to a sustainable, high volume and secure flow of humanitarian aid to civilians in the Gaza Strip. Dear friends, in another region, in Nagorno-Karabakh, we have become witnesses to yet another humanitarian crisis affecting tens of thousands of people. This acute humanitarian crisis has turned into a mass exodus of the Armenian population from the region, and we need to take all necessary measures to provide immediate humanitarian relief and also addresses the long-term situation of the ethnic Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh. At the same time, the increased and immediate needs of Armenia stemming from the events of last September should be properly and adequately addressed. Cyprus supports the normalization and the peace process between Armenia and Azerbaijan within the framework of the European Union mediation, which will undoubtedly contribute to the long-term stability and prosperity of the wider region. Any incentives to facilitate and encourage such development should be balanced and carefully planned and implemented. Dear friends, the aforementioned crises and tragedies clearly illustrate that prolonged political stalemates should not be treated with complacency. The absence of diplomacy and dialogue can bring cycles of perpetual violence with catastrophic repercussions. It is a reality that there are no frozen conflicts. As I have mentioned, the vacuum created by the absence of viable, lasting peace becomes a fertile ground for crisis. This is something that we know very well in my country. Human rights in Cyprus remain tragically an unfulfilled promise for all Cypriots as a result of the illegal invasion of Turkey in 1974 and the continued occupation. 2024 marks the 50th anniversary of the Turkish invasion, 50 years of continued illegal occupation, 5 decades of division, continued violations of fundamental freedoms and basic human rights on the European continent cannot continue. Always, but especially in anniversaries such as this, my thoughts are constantly with the hundreds of thousands of Cypriots who were displaced and year after year wait for the moment that they will return to their homes. They are with the families of the missing persons that desperately seek for information on the fate of their loved ones. They are with the enclaved that stoically await for the end of the division. These are all matters that fall within your mandate to be informed of, but also your responsibility to act upon via resolutions of the Parliamentary Assembly and via judgments of the Court. We support and aspire to these actions as they greatly reinforce our efforts to restore respect for the human rights of all Cypriots. Dear friends, it is high time for peace. All Cypriots, Greek and Turkish Cypriots, Maronites, Armenians, Latins, deserve the same human rights and fundamental freedoms as all other Europeans. They deserve to prosper in a reunified country, member state of the European Union, where their human rights and fundamental freedoms are safeguarded and upheld. As the first president of the Republic of Cyprus, born just a few months before the 1974 Turkish invasion, and growing up in a de facto divided Cyprus, my vision and my utmost priority is to reunify my country and its people so that we can all live in conditions of peace, security, and prosperity. I have been actively pursuing this vision since the first day that I assumed my duties, and I want to reassure you here today that I will continue to do so with determination and courage. I'm committed to reaching a solution for a bizonal, bicommunal federation with political equality as prescribed in the relevant UN Security Council resolutions. This is the only viable path ahead. In this regard, I welcome the recent appointment of the personal envoy of the UN Secretary General, Ms. Maria Angela Olkin-Cuellar, and aspire for her contribution in resuming negotiations on the basis prescribed by the relevant UN Security Council resolutions and from where they were interrupted at Grand Montana in 2017. Ensuring a conducive surrounding environment is also imperative. Regrettably, on the ground, we continue to be faced with successive provocations and violations, as well as attempts of incursion by the Turkish occupation forces into the buffer zone in a number of areas. We have responded to these challenges with calm and restraint, while taking all action to ensure that the status of the buffer zone is safeguarded. Our focus remains to chart a positive way forward and we are even more determined to this perspective. Dear friends, I stand today before you asking for your support and tangible contribution as we strive for peace. The Council of Europe in general and the Parliamentary Assembly in particular have the political legitimacy to actively contribute to our efforts, both to ensure that there is a conducive environment and in our efforts for a comprehensive settlement. One such example is the report of the member of the Parliamentary Assembly, Mr. Piero Fassino, regarding Varosha, which is under preparation. It is of utmost importance that we remain vigilant that any move other than the transfer of the area to the administration of the United Nations constitutes a violation of the relevant Security Council resolutions, including 550 of 1984 and 789 of 1992. In this regard, the Council of Europe's report offers a unique opportunity to convey the urgency of the matter and the need to respect international legality and the territorial integrity of the Republic of Cyprus, and to call for the restoration of the property rights of the displaced inhabitants as recognized by the European Court of Human Rights in the case of Cyprus versus Turkey. Esteemed members of the Parliamentary Assembly, the sole answer to the challenges we face is collective multilateral action. The institutions that are drivers of such action must be able to adapt and respond to challenges so as to effectively address. In fact, during the fourth summit in Iceland, we reaffirmed our steadfast support to multilateralism, and we also committed to engage in regular high-level dialogue with member states and partners in order to strengthen the Reykjavik principles of democracy. This should continue to be our main focus in order to collectively and effectively face these common challenges. In closing, I would like once again to warmly congratulate you on the important and extremely valuable work that you perform here in the Assembly. This year marks 75 years since the foundation of the Council of Europe. 75 years since its establishment, the Council remains our lighthouse. We ought to learn from the past, but also from ongoing crises in order to build a better future for the next generations based on peace and prosperity. At this critical juncture, it is imperative for all of us to take a step back, rethink about how we envision our future in this continent and how the institutional framework can be a more effective vehicle to achieve our vision. On my end, I can assure you that Cyprus remains fairly committed to its responsibilities and obligations and will do everything in its power to preserve and promote the fundamental values of the Council of Europe. We remain committed to maintain and enhance the relevance of this vital organization. The Republic of Cyprus will always stand on the right side of history and by the Council's side in its tireless efforts for the protection of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. I thank you.
Mr. President, dear Nikos, thank you very much. Thanks, first of all, for your kind words upon my presidency and, of course, overall, for your most interesting address. Members of the Assembly have questions to put to you. We will first hear questions from the speakers on behalf of the political groups and then hear a response from Mr. Christodoulides to those questions. Please, will the speakers limit their intervention to 30 seconds, because it's known that this procedure is to ask questions and not making speeches. First is Mr. Piero Fassino on behalf of the Socialists, Greens and Democrats. Mr. Fassino, you have the floor.
Grazie, signor Presidente. Grazie della sua presenza. Quest'anno, come lei ha ricordato, si celebreranno 60 anni dal dispiegamento di una forza di interposizione ONU e 50 anni dalla divisione dell'isola. Almeno 5 generazioni, tra cui la sua, sono nate, cresciute e vissute in un'isola divisa. Dal piano Annan ai negoziati di Crans-Montana, tutti i tentativi in questi anni per arrivare a una soluzione sono falliti. Allora io le chiedo, perché bisogna fare delle domande, quali sono secondo lei gli ostacoli che hanno impedito fino ad oggi una riunificazione dell'isola? La soluzione del piano Annan, una repubblica federale bizonale e bicomunale, è ancora valida? Ci sono le condizioni per realizzarle? Quali sono secondo lei? E ci sono le condizioni perché questa soluzione consenta ai cittadini turco-ciprioti di riconoscersi? E in ogni caso quali sono le proposte che lei intende avanzare per rilanciare il progetto, visto che ha detto appena adesso, io ho apprezzato molto, che considera un suo obiettivo strategico, un suo obiettivo strategico la riunificazione. Infine lei sa che io sono rapporteur per Varosha, lo ha citato, ho visitato quella città deserta e vorrei chiedere anche questo, come pensa che sia possibile un accordo su Varosha? Se è possibile e come lei intende lavorare per facilitare l'arrivo di giungere ad un accordo anche sullo status di Varosha. Grazie.
Mr. President, you have the floor.
Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ για την ερώτηση. Αν πραγματικά πίστευα ότι η επίλυση του Κυπριακού δεν ήταν εφικτή, δεν θα ξεκινούσα αυτή την προσπάθεια. Και χαίρομαι πάρα πολύ γιατί ο Γενικός Γραμματέας των Ηνωμένων Εθνών, αναγνωρίζοντας την ετοιμότητα μας να προχωρήσουμε και δείχνοντας και τη δική του δέσμευση στην επίλυση του Κυπριακού στη βάση του συμφωνημένου πλαισίου της Διζωνικής Δικοινοτικής Ομοσπονδίας, γιατί ήταν και αυτό ένα από τα ερωτήματά σας, έχει προχωρήσει στο διορισμό της κυρίας Οκιούν ως προσωπική απεσταλμένη, η οποία θα επισκεφθεί την Κύπρο τις επόμενες των ημερών για να ξεκινήσει μια νέα προσπάθεια. Η επίλυση του Κυπριακού είναι εφικτή. Η παρούσα κατάσταση πραγμάτων δεν μπορεί να αποτελεί τη λύση του Κυπριακού ούτε για τους Ελληνοκύπριους ούτε για τους Τουρκοκύπριους. Και αν, αγαπητέ κύριε Φασίνο, η επίλυση του Κυπριακού εξαρτώταν από τους Ελληνοκύπριους και τους Τουρκοκύπριους, το Κυπριακό θα είχε λυθεί εδώ και πάρα πολλά χρόνια. Η επίλυση του Κυπριακού και ο βασικός λόγος μη επίλυσης του τόσα χρόνια είναι η στάση της Τουρκίας. Είναι η στάση της τουρκικής πλευράς, η οποία εμποδίζει την επίλυση του Κυπριακού. Και μέσα σε αυτό το πλαίσιο είμαστε έτοιμοι να εξετάσουμε μια κατάσταση πραγμάτων η οποία μέσα από τη λύση του Κυπριακού θα οδηγήσει σε μια αμοιβαία υποφελή κατάσταση πραγμάτων για όλους τους εμπλεκόμενους συμπεριλαμβανομένης και της ίδιας της Τουρκίας. Η επίλυση του Κυπριακού, ναι, είναι εφικτή αν υπάρχει αναγκαία πολιτική βούληση. Και ως κάποιος, και καταλήγω με αυτό, που γεννήθηκα λίγες μέρες μετά λίγους μήνες πριν την τουρκική εισβολή και μεγάλωσα σε μια χώρα διαιρεμένη, σίγουρα θέλω να παραδώσω στις επόμενες γενιές, θέλω να παραδώσω στα παιδιά μου, σε όλα τα παιδιά της Κύπρου, Ελληνοκύπριους και Τουρκοκύπριους, μια επανενωμένη πατρίδα. Γιατί μια Κύπρος χωρίς να είναι επανενωμένη, σίγουρα το μέλλον της δεν είναι διασφαλισμένο.
Mrs. Ingrid Skau, on behalf of the EPP, has now the floor. Dear Ingrid.
Thank you, President. And it is our understanding that Cyprus and France have proposed to supply humanitarian aid on the civilians of Gaza through the sea corridor from Cyprus. Time is of urgency in this humanitarian crisis. What is the status of this plan and how soon can it be implemented? And President, we have not forgotten the Cyprus problem. Famagusta is on our agenda. How can we in the international community and more specifically the Council of Europe contribute to you and your people to have these rights respected? Thank you.
Ingrid. Mr. President.
Ο διορισμός του κ. Φασίνου ως ραπορτέρ για το θέμα της αμοχώστου είναι μια σημαντικότατη εξέλιξη, κάτι που δείχνει και το ενδιαφέρον της Κοινοβουλευτικής Συνέλευσης του Συμβουλίου της Ευρώπης για το θέμα της αμοχώστου. Γιατί είναι πολύ σημαντικό να διασφαλίσουμε ότι δεν θα γίνουν οποιασδήποτε ενέργειες στην περιοχή της Αμοχώστου που θα δυσκολεύουν ακόμη περισσότερο την προοπτική επανέναξη των συνομιλιών, αλλά και την προοπτική επίλυση του Κυπριακού. Υπάρχουν συγκεκριμένα ψηφίσματα των Ηνωμένων Εθνών για το θέμα της Αμοχώστου και η εφαρμογή αυτών των ψηφισμάτων θα είναι η καλύτερη απόδειξη ότι όντως επιθυμούμε την επίλυση του Κυπριακού. Έρχομαι στο θέμα του ανθρωπιστικού διαδρόμου, που όντως η πρωτοβουλία της Κυπριακής Δημοκρατίας έχει χαιρετιστεί από την γαλλική κυβέρνηση, από την Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση, από πολλά κράτη, από τις Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες. Όπως προανέφερα, η Κυπριακή Δημοκρατία είναι το κράτος μέλος της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης που γειτονιάζει με την περιοχή. Είμαστε το κράτος που έχουμε εξαιρετικές σχέσεις με όλα τα εμπλεκόμενα μέρη. Έχουμε εξαιρετικές σχέσεις με το Ισραήλ, με την Παλαιστίνη, με την Αίγυπτο, με την Ιορδανία, με όλες τις χώρες της περιοχής. Και μέσα σε αυτό το πλαίσιο, από την πρώτη στιγμή, η Κύπρος αξιοποιήθηκε για την απομάκρυση πληθυσμού από την περιοχή. Όλοι όσοι ήθελαν να αποχωρήσουν από την περιοχή, κυρίως Ευρωπαίοι, χρησιμοποίησαν την Κύπρο για να απομακρυνθούν. Και κατά δεύτερο, προχωρήσαμε στην πρότασή μας για τη δημιουργία ενός θαλάσσιου ανθρωπιστικού διαδρόμου από τη Λάρνακα στην Γάζα, έτσι ώστε να μεταφέρεται ανθρωπιστική βοήθεια για τον άμαχο πληθυσμό εκεί. Χαίρομαι γιατί η πρωτοβουλία αυτή έχει αρχίσει να υλοποιείται. Ήδη, και θέλω να ευχαριστήσω τη Βρετανική κυβέρνηση, γιατί ήταν με τη βοήθεια της Βρετανικής κυβέρνησης, έχει μεταφερθεί ανθρωπιστική βοήθεια από τη Λάρνακα, όχι απευθείας στη Γάζα, αλλά μέσω Αιγύπτου στην περιοχή. Συνεχίζουμε τις διαβουλεύσεις μας με όλα τα εμπλεκόμενα μέρη, με το Ισραήλ, με τους Παλαιστίνιους, για να συνεχιστεί αυτή η απρόσκοπτη μεταφορά ανθρωπιστικής βοήθειας. Είμαστε έτοιμοι, ανά πάσα στιγμή έχουμε την υποδομή στην Κύπρο, έτσι ώστε να διασφαλίσουμε την ασφάλεια αυτών των προϊόντων της ανθρωπιστικής βοήθειας που μεταφέρεται στη Γάζα. Ο ρόλος της Κυπριακής Δημοκρατίας και οι εξαιρετικές της σχέσεις αναγνωρίζονται από όλα τα κράτη της περιοχής και είμαστε έτοιμοι, επαναλαμβάνω, ανά πάσα στιγμή να αποστείλουμε περισσότερη ανθρωπιστική βοήθεια στην περιοχή. Και χαίρομαι και θέλω να το αναφέρω, να χαιρετήσω και τη στάση της γαλλικής κυβέρνησης, τη διοργάνωση μια σχετική συνόδου στο Παρίσι, όπου συζητήθηκε συγκεκριμένα αυτή η πτυχή και ήταν κατά τη διάρκεια αυτής της συνόδου που παρουσιάστηκε για πρώτη φορά σε λεπτομέρεια η κυπριακή πρόταση.
On behalf of the European Conservative, Oleksiy Goncharenko. Dear Oleksiy, you have the floor.
Unfortunately, Cyprus for decades was used by...
No, you have to use another mic, Oleksiy. We cannot hear you. Please use another mic. Okay.
Mic.
That's
Thank
okay
you very
now.
much. Mr. President, Cyprus for decades was used by Russian oligarchs and crooks for money laundering. And even after the start of Russian invasion against my country, Ukraine, 2 years ago, there are media reports telling that such pockets of Putin as Abramovich, Usmanov, Mordashov used Cyprus to hide their dirty money from the sanctions and to launder them. So my question is, what is the plan of you and Cyprus government in order to stop it and to reforge golden visas and passports to steel or copper handcuffs? Thank you.
Η Κυπριακή Δημοκρατία από την πρώτη στιγμή, όπως ανέφερα και στην ομιλία μου, ήταν στη σωστή πλευρά της ιστορίας. Η Κυπριακή Δημοκρατία από την πρώτη στιγμή καταδίκασε τη ρωσική εισβολή στην Ουκρανία για πολλούς λόγους, συμπεριλαμβανομένου του λόγου ότι είμαστε θύματα της ίδιας συμπεριφοράς από την Τουρκία. Και η οποιαδήποτε εισβολή ή κατοχή, είτε προέρχεται από τη Ρωσία, είτε προέρχεται από την Τουρκία, δεν είναι διαφορετική. Είναι κατοχή, είναι παράνομη εισβολή. Και από την πρώτη στιγμή ήμασταν στη σωστή πλευρά της ιστορίας. Από την πρώτη στιγμή εφαρμόζουμε όλες τις κυρώσεις της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης. Και είναι σημαντικό, γιατί αναφέρατε ένα θέμα το οποίο προβληματίζει την ίδια την Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση, να δείτε ποιοι δεν εφαρμόζουν, ποιες χώρες δεν εφαρμόζουν τις κυρώσεις της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης, κάνοντας τις κυρώσεις μη αποτελεσματικές. Και αναφέρουμε σε χώρες που ενδεχομένως κάποιοι στην Ουκρανία να θεωρούν ως σύμμαχο. Και σας καλώ να ψάξετε ποιες χώρες, επαναλαμβάνω, δεν εφαρμόζουν τις κυρώσεις. Έχει έκθεση η ίδια η Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση για τις ποιες χώρες δεν εφαρμόζουν τις κυρώσεις της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης. Αναφερθήκατε στο θέμα των ρωσικών επενδύσεων στην Κύπρο. Ναι, στέκομαι εδώ με τόλμη απέναντί σας και σας λέω ότι έγιναν λάθη. Όλα αυτά αποτελούν παρελθόν στην Κύπρο. Στην Κύπρο δεν υπάρχουν ούτε χρυσά διαβατήρια, ούτε χρυσές βίζες. Και σας παραπέμπω να δείτε και τις σχετικές εκθέσεις και της Μάνιβαλ και άλλες εκθέσεις που έχουν γίνει για την Κύπρο. Λάθη έγιναν στο παρελθόν και οι πρώτοι που πλήρωσαν αυτά τα λάθη ήταν η ίδια η Κυπριακή Δημοκρατία, ήταν ο ίδιος ο Κυπριακός λαός.
On behalf of ALDE, Mr. Hubert Büchel. Dear Hubert, you have the floor.
Dear colleagues, on behalf of the ALDE Group, I would like to express the gratitude to President Christodoulides for his remarks. The European Court of Human Rights plays a pivotal role in safeguarding the fundamental principles of the Council of Europe. While each member state is legally obliged to implement its rulings, not every state fulfills this obligation. Could the Republic of Cyprus provide insights into the measures being taken to ensure the effective implementation of the legal binding judgment of the court? Thank you.
Ευχαριστώ για την ερώτηση, γιατί έχετε αγγίξει ένα θέμα που θεωρώ ότι αγγίζει τη σημασία του Συμβουλίου της Ευρώπης, της Κοινοβουλευτικής Συνέλευσης των Οργάνων του Συμβουλίου της Ευρώπης. Η μη εφαρμογή των αποφάσεων του δικαστηρίου. Θα μιλήσω πρώτα για την Κύπρο, γιατί δεν υπάρχει άλλη επιλογή για μας από την πλήρη συμμόρφωση με τις αποφάσεις του δικαστηρίου. Δεν υπάρχει καμία απολύτως δικαιολογία για να μην εφαρμόζονται οι αποφάσεις του δικαστηρίου. Την ίδια στιγμή όμως πρέπει να παραδεχτούμε ότι ένας σημαντικός αριθμός χωρών δεν εφαρμόζουν τις αποφάσεις αυτές, είτε μέρος των αποφάσεων, είτε τις αποφάσεις στην ολότητά τους. Και αυτό επηρεάζει την αποτελεσματικότητα του ίδιου του δικαστηρίου. Και είναι κάτι που θεωρώ θα πρέπει, χωρίς να παρεμβαίνω με καθοδήποτε τρόπο στα δικά σας θέματα, είναι κάτι το οποίο θα πρέπει να απασχολήσει και την ίδια την Κοινοβουλευτική Συνέλευση του Συμβουλίου της Ευρώπης. Ποια είναι η αντίδραση είτε της Κοινοβουλευτικής Συνέλευσης είτε του Συμβουλίου της Ευρώπης προς αυτά τα κράτη που δεν εφαρμόζουν τις αποφάσεις του δικαστηρίου? Γιατί αντιλαμβάνεστε ότι αν συνεχιστεί αυτή η κατάσταση, τόσο η αποτελεσματικότητα του δικαστηρίου θα αμφισβητηθεί και κατά δεύτερο θα ενθαρρυνθούν και άλλα κράτη να μην εφαρμόζουν τις αποφάσεις.
On behalf of the United European Left, Mr. Paul Gavan. Dear Paul, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, for a very thoughtful speech. I want to ask you about the Akrotiri airbase on your island, which is classed as British sovereign territory. We know it's being used to launch spy planes to collect intelligence over Gaza in support of Israel's barbaric assault against the people of Gaza, and has also been used as a base for bombing Yemen in a serious escalation of violence in that region. Mr. President, what is your government's view of these operations?
Θέλω να ξεκαθαρίσω ότι η Κυπριακή Δημοκρατία δεν εμπλέκεται σε οποιαδήποτε επιχείρηση στρατιωτικού χαρακτήρα στην περιοχή. Σε καμία απολύτως περίπτωση. Ως προς τη χρήση των Βρετανικών βάσεων στην Κύπρο, όπως αναφέρεται, ναι, βρισκόμαστε σε επικοινωνία με τη Βρετανική κυβέρνηση στο πλαίσιο που καθορίζει η συνθήκη εγκαθίδρυσης της Κυπριακής Δημοκρατίας και τα συνοδευτικά έγγραφα στην ελόγω συνθήκη. Για μας, η ασφάλεια της Κύπρου, των κατοίκων της Κύπρου, όπως και οι σχέσεις μας με τα κράτη της περιοχής, αποτελεί την ύψιστη προτεραιότητα της κυβέρνησης μας και σε καμία απολύτως περίπτωση δεν εμπλεκόμαστε, θέλω να το επαναλάβω, ως Κυπριακή Δημοκρατία σε οποιαδήποτε επιχείρηση στρατιωτικού χαρακτήρα. Όπως είχα την ευκαιρία να αναφέρω προηγουμένως, εμπλεκόμαστε σε επιχειρήσεις ανθρωπιστικής φύσεως για να βοηθήσουμε τους πληθυσμούς της περιοχής και όχι σε στρατιωτικής φύσεως επιχειρήσεις.
Dear Mr. President, we are going to change the procedure now. Since we don't have much time left, I will give the floor to the first 5 colleagues on the list. I will ask you to take notes and answer in your closure. So, the first is Madame Katalin Tsobor, who has the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. La déclaration de Reykjavik a placé le Conseil de l'Europe sur une voie ambitieuse pour faire face à divers nouveaux défis, dont la migration et la nécessité de lutter contre le traite des êtres humains et le trafic des migrants. Chypre a été en première ligne des arrivées massives de migrants ces dernières années. Selon vous, sur quelle action le Conseil de l'Europe devrait se concentrer à ce domaine? Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Katalin. Now, Mrs. Sonia Khadjarian.
Your Excellency, it's an honor to welcome you to this assembly. Recently, the government of Armenia came up with the initiative of the Crossroads of Peace, which is about unblocking the infrastructure, increasing the interconnectivity in the region. The project will greatly contribute to the prosperity, lasting peace, and cooperation among the nations of the region and beyond. Mr. President, what does Cyprus think of this project? Thank you.
Monsieur Marie-Didier, vous avez la parole.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci pour vos propos. Je souhaite tout d'abord, Monsieur le Président, vous réaffirmer notre attachement à l'intégrité territoriale de Chypre et à une solution d'un État bizonal et bicommunautaire. Je veux aussi vous assurer de notre solidarité face aux provocations de la force d'occupation du nord de l'île ou lorsque M. Erdogan instrumentalise l'immigration à des fins de déstabilisation. Vous l'avez dit, la République de Chypre est prête aux discussions, mais Monsieur le Président, comment, à vos yeux, infléchir la position de la Turquie et qu'attendez-vous de notre Assemblée pour assurer la préservation des droits humains sur l'ensemble de l'île?
Mr. Güzan Hassipoglu, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am the elected representative of Turkish Cypriot people. And as Turkish Cypriots, isn't it unfair for the Turkish Cypriots to be isolated due to the rejection of all United Nations previous plans by your side? Because as you know, in 2004, we as Turkish Cypriots had approved the unification plan and you had rejected it. And now you are in the European Union and we Turkish Cypriots are the ones who are being penalized and under isolations and embargoes. So what is your plan? And at that time, Kofi Annan had made a statement in his report and stated that Greek Cypriot side is not ready to share the governance and wealth around the island. This was 13 years ago. Are you now ready to share? Are you now ready to acknowledge the sovereign equality, the political equality? Are you now ready to share the governance and prosperity of the island with the Turkish Cypriots? Did you change your
Mr. Hasipoglou, I don't want to interrupt you, but it is clear that we are asking questions for 30 seconds and we are not making statements. So you have already asked 2 questions instead of 1.
Why don't you accept the European Court of Human Rights authorized immovable property commission as an effective remedy?
Thank you, Mr. Hasipoglou. Thank you very much, Damien Gauthier. Monsieur Damien Gauthier.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci, Monsieur le Président, pour les engagements que vous avez pris et pour les propos importants que vous avez eus sur le multilatéralisme. Le dialogue direct est aussi important dans un processus de paix. Mon pays, la Suisse, a eu l'occasion souvent de recevoir des discussions sur l'avenir de Chypre. Il serait évidemment ravi d'en recevoir à nouveau. Est-ce qu'on peut être optimiste sur l'avenir prochain de tels dialogues directs? Ça m'intéresserait de vous entendre sur cette question. Et puis, deuxième question, vous avez à juste titre beaucoup insisté sur les droits humains en République de Chypre et votre volonté de les développer, notamment la protection des femmes, aussi contre la violence de genre. Un point que vous n'avez pas mentionné, c'est les droits des personnes LGBT. J'aimerais bien vous entendre sur ce point, sur les progrès que vous souhaitez faire dans votre pays en cette matière. Je vous remercie.
Merci, M. Gauthier. Mr. President, please reply to the questions. I would ask you to be as brief as you can. We only have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Η πρώτη ερώτηση αφορούσε το μεταναστευτικό. Και όντως η Κύπρος είναι μια χώρα της πρώτης γραμμής, μια χώρα που αντιμετωπίζει σοβαρότατες προκλήσεις, αφού αυτή τη στιγμή που μιλάμε 6 περίπου της 100 του πληθυσμού της Κύπρου είναι μετανάστες. Με ρωτήσατε τι μπορεί να κάνει το Συμβούλιο της Ευρώπης. Το πιο σημαντικό που μπορεί να κάνει το Συμβούλιο της Ευρώπης, που πρέπει να κάνει η διεθνής κοινότητα, που πρέπει να συνεργαστούμε όλοι, είναι να αντιμετωπίσουμε τις γενεσιουργές αιτίες του μεταναστευτικού. Αυτό που λέμε τα root causes της μετανάστευσης. Γιατί αν δεν αντιμετωπίσουμε τους λόγους που όλοι αυτοί οι άνθρωποι φεύγουν από τις χώρες τους, όποια διαχείριση και αν κάνουμε στην Ευρώπη, αυτό το φαινόμενο θα συνεχιστεί. Άρα πρέπει, και εκεί πρέπει να επικεντρωθεί η προσπάθεια μας, αν θέλουμε να αντιμετωπίσουμε το πρόβλημα της μετανάστευσης, να αντιμετωπίσουμε τα φαινόμενα που οδηγούν αυτούς τους ανθρώπους να φεύγουν από τις χώρες τους. Σε σχέση με την πρόταση της Αρμενίας, ως Κυπριακή Δημοκρατία τη στηρίζουμε και στηρίζουμε οποιαδήποτε πρόταση η οποία προωθεί τη συνεργασία ανάμεσα στα κράτη και θεωρώ είναι προς τη σωστή κατεύθυνση. Αναφέρθηκα στα ανθρώπινα δικαιώματα, ναι, στα ανθρώπινα δικαιώματα για όλους τους Κυπρίους. Για μας δεν υπάρχει διαφορετικό, που δεν ξέρω, ενδεχομένως να ταξίδεψε στο Στρασβούργο με διαβατήριο της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης, διαβατήριο της Κυπριακής Δημοκρατίας, η όποια παραβίαση των ανθρωπίνων δικαιωμάτων των Τουρκοκυπρίων, των Ελληνοκυπρίων ή αυτό που αναφέρατε περί απομόνωσης, ξέρετε που οφείλεται? Οφείλεται σε ένα και μόνο πράγμα, η απομόνωση των Τουρκοκυπρίων. Οφείλεται στην τουρκική εισβολή και τη συνεχιζόμενη κατοχή. Αυτό στερεί τους Τουρκοκύπριους από τα δικαιώματά τους. Γιατί οι Τουρκοκύπροι, και το γνωρίζετε πάρα πολύ καλά, από τη μέρα ένταξης της Κυπριακής Δημοκρατίας, για να δώσω ένα παράδειγμα, έχουν διαβατήρια της Κυπριακής Δημοκρατίας ως πολίτες της Κυπριακής Δημοκρατίας. Με την έγκριση της Κυπριακής Δημοκρατίας υπάρχει ο χρηματοδοτικός κανονισμός της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης, που οι Τουρκοκύπροι συμπατριώτες μας με την έγκριση της Κυπριακής Δημοκρατίας λαμβάνουν σημαντική οικονομική ενίσχυση. Υπάρχει ο κανονισμός της πράσινης γραμμής και πάλι για τους Τουρκοκύπριους συμπατριώτες μας. Και θέλω να σας αναφέρω με την ευκαιρία και την ερώτησή σας ότι τις επόμενες των ημερών θα προχωρήσω και στην ανακοίνωση μονομερών μέτρων προς τους Τουρκοκύπριους συμπατριώτες μας. Και όπως συζητούμε εδώ, αγαπητέ κύριε Χασίπογλου, αυτό που θα ήθελα να σας καλέσω να δείτε ότι και το δικό σας μέλλον ως Τουρκοκύπροι και το δικό μας ως Ελληνοκύπροι και το μέλλον της Κύπρου χωρίς επανένωση της πατρίδας μας δεν θα είναι θετικό. Γι' αυτό σας καλώ ακόμη μια φορά και είμαι σίγουρος για τη θέληση της πλειοψηφίας των Τουρκοκυπρίων για την ανάγκη να σταλούν και από εσάς τα σωστά μηνύματα προς την Τουρκία. Έχετε απόλυτο δίκαιο ότι στην παρέμβασή μου παρέλειψα να αναφερθώ στο συγκεκριμένο θέμα, ένα θέμα που τα τελευταία χρόνια στη χώρα μας έγιναν σημαντικά βήματα για κατοχύρωση των δικαιωμάτων των ΛΟΑΤΚΙ ατόμων. Και τα βήματα που έγιναν, και εδώ είναι ένας σημαντικός ρόλος που διαδραματίζει το Συμβούλιο της Ευρώπης, έγιναν στη βάση των αρχών του Συμβουλίου της Ευρώπης και της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης και έχει θεσμοθετηθεί ένα ισχυρό πλαίσιο καταπολέμησης των όποιων διακρίσεων ή της βίας εις βάρος των ΛΟΑΤΚΙ ατόμων. Έχουν γίνει αλλαγές στον ποινικό κώδικα της Κύπρου το 2015, το 2017, κατά τρόπο που αποτελεί πλέον ποινικό αδίκημα η ομοφοβική ή τρανσφοβική ρητορική μίσους, ενώ την ίδια στιγμή οποιαδήποτε πράξη βίας επισύρει σοβαρές ποινές. Έχουμε επίσης προχωρήσει με την θεσμοθέτηση της πολιτικής συμβίωσης, το σύμφωνο συμβίωσης, από το 2015. Το 2021 προχωρήσαμε με την ετοιμασία εθνικής στρατηγικής για τα ανθρώπινα δικαιώματα, που είναι πλήρως ευθυγραμμισμένη με την ευρωπαϊκή σχετική στρατηγική. Προχωρήσαμε το 2022 και έχουμε υποβάλει στη Βουλή νομοσχέδιο για την νομική αναγνώριση της ταυτότητας φύλου. Το 2023 το Μάιο ψηφίστηκε αυτό σε πρόταση νόμου για ποινικοποίηση της εφαρμογής τεχνικών που αποσκοπούν στη μεταβολή και την καταστολή του σεξουαλικού προσανατολισμού. Έχουμε ιδρύσει στην αστυνομία ειδικό τμήμα για να αντιμετωπίζει τέτοιου είδους θέματα και χαίρομαι ότι τα τελευταία χρόνια και με τη δική σας βοήθεια, της Κοινοβουλευτικής Συνέλευσης του Συμβουλίου της Ευρώπης, του Συμβουλίου της Ευρώπης γενικότερα, αλλά και της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης, έχουν γίνει σημαντικότατα βήματα στην Κύπρο.
Dear Mr. President, thank you so much for being with us today. I want to thank you most warmly for your address and for the answers you have already given to the questions. Dear colleagues, I remind you that voting is open for the election of the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights and 3 judges to the European Court of Human Rights in respect of Bulgaria, Lithuania, and Luxembourg. The votes will close at 6 p.m., so I invite those of you who have not yet voted to do so. Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, we will now hear an address by His Excellency Mr. Jakov Milatovic, President of Montenegro. After his address, Mr. Milatovic will take questions from the floor.
Son Excellence, Monsieur Jakov Milatovic, président du Monténégro.
Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, now it is my honor to welcome another president of one of our member states among us in this hemicycle, His Excellency Mr. Jakov Milatovic, President of Montenegro. Mr. President, let me wish you a warm welcome among us and also congratulate you. You are the youngest person having been elected to the highest function of your country. In your inaugural speech, you stated that, and I quote, "My mission is for Montenegro to become a country of equal opportunities for all its citizens, where hard work and education will be the main factors for success in life." You also declared that your top priority will be to speed up Montenegro's movement towards full membership in the European Union, your country having applied for EU membership in 2008, and you stood ready to undertake all the necessary activities to successfully complete the reform and other necessary processes of transformation of Montenegrin society. Mr. President, you can rest assured that we in this House, the House of Democracy, will always be ready to accompany your country in its further protection and promotion of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Your Excellency, I have the honor to give you the floor. Your statement will be followed by questions by parliamentarians.
Thank you. Dear President of the Parliamentary Assembly, dear Secretary General of the Council of Europe, dear members of the Parliamentary Assembly, it is both an honor and a great pleasure to address the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe in the year in which we celebrate together the 75th anniversary of this admirable institution. This milestone marks a significant legacy in advancing and safeguarding the foundational principles of every free society: human rights, the rule of law, and democracy. Recognizing this significant occasion, it is imperative to underscore the commitment of Montenegro to upholding the very principles that the Council of Europe stands for. In the area of fundamental rights, our country has established a robust legislative and institutional framework, transposing the EU acquis into the national legislation and ensuring that Montenegro continues to largely meet its international obligations on human rights and media freedom. However, being aware of some of the inherited challenges in the implementation of international standards related to human rights and media freedom, Montenegro will strive to improve the media environment, including to the already embodied changes of the criminal code, enabling the special protection of the journalists, as well as the true equality of opportunities for the vulnerable groups, including women, youth, LGBT+ population, people with disabilities, Roma, Egyptians, and others. This resolute commitment is not merely a formality, but a testament of our firm belief in the principles that bind us together as members of this esteemed organization. My address today is also an opportunity to present to this Assembly historical changes that Montenegro experienced over the previous few years, which resulted in a fundamental shift towards a genuine democratic development in our country. Following the parliamentary elections in 2020, Montenegro voted in a new government after nearly 3 decades of the rule by the same political party, stemming from the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, characterized by a low level of trust in the electoral system, politicization of the public administration, and captured institutions. The transition of power came to a completion after the presidential elections of the last year, echoing a simple message from the citizens that Montenegro should become a country where justice is evenly distributed, opportunities are equal, and where hard work and education are the only factors for success in life. Today, almost 4 years after the change of power in Montenegro, the elections are not anymore a question of life and death, as they are still in many places around the globe, but a true pillar of a democratic choice of the people. Recently, the Parliamentary Committee of the Parliament of Montenegro was created in order to pursue electoral reform aimed towards further reforms of the electoral process. But the democratic process is not just an exercise in periodic voting. It is a commitment to a continuous and responsive relationship between the state and its citizens. It is a promise that the ideals of democracy and the principles of justice will be upheld, and the aspirations of the people will be realized. It is a process of establishing strong and independent institutions, ready to be a reliable instrument in strengthening the rule of law and guarantee of a legal security to all citizens. Within just over 6 months of my presidential term, the key institutions crucial for establishing the rule of law and accelerating Montenegro's journey towards the European Union have been successfully unlocked. In November, after more than 3 years of persistent efforts, the Constitutional Court attained its full composition. In December, after more than 5 years of unsuccessful attempts, the Judicial Council was successfully completed. Within the election of the missing members from the ranks of eminent lawyers. And by the end of January of this year, the Parliament is expected to select the new Supreme State Prosecutor, after the position was in acting mode since 2019. All appointments were carried out with large parliamentary support across diverse political entities, underscoring Montenegro's progress towards a nation where political dialogue is reaching a more mature stage. This has to a significant extent stabilized the judiciary system, and it allows the country to complete the set of conditions necessary for accelerating the EU accession. And although organized crime and fight against corruption is still a challenge, enormous steps with the support from our strategic partners have been made in processing high-level police and judiciary officials suspected to be involved in crime and corruption. The major step towards a more trustworthy judiciary in Montenegro was brought through the work of the newly elected Chief Special State Prosecutor. Further progress in this regard is expected after the establishment of the full capacity of the judicial system in the country. Ladies and gentlemen, a society built on the rule of law is a precondition for a thriving economy that draws investments, fosters economic stability, and fuels growth. Therefore, continued economic reforms, along with the judiciary reforms, are key to bringing Montenegro closer to the EU. In the past 3 years, following the political changes, Montenegro has experienced one of the most intense periods of structural reforms in its recent history. The focus has been on the reforms in the labor market, innovation, business environment, including access to finance and corporate governance. The fiscal reforms have doubled the minimum wage, increased the average salary, and decreased the tax burden on wages, thereby stimulating employment and reducing the grey economy in the labor market. This all led to a speedier convergence of Montenegro with the EU. And at a difficult time, from an economic abyss that the country experienced in 2020, as the economic decline was 15%, Montenegro turned the biggest economic downturn into the greatest economic growth. However, the path forward is still fraught with challenges. The living standards are still way below the European levels. Thus, reforms in the education system, health and welfare, coupled with additional measures to protect our environment, together with a large-scale infrastructure investment cycle, are imperative in order to accelerate further our convergence with the EU. And the stability of the financial system has been further strengthened by the meritocratic election of the new governor of the central bank, thus ending the previous acting state in the central bank ever since 2022. Dear members of the Parliamentary Assembly, our journey and the journey of our region, the Balkans, towards a better future needs a sincere confrontation with our past. And it is my firm belief that only a country willing to face its historical truths can genuinely lay the groundwork for a stable and reconciliatory future. This commitment has been the cornerstone of my presidency as well. And I firmly believe that it is the duty of my generation of politicians in the Balkans to both forgive and seek forgiveness, ensuring there is no denial of the war crimes, as facing the truth is the only path towards a genuine reconciliation in the region. And by confronting our history, we paved the way for a society where the wounds of the past can heal and where the lessons learned become the foundation of a more resilient and compassionate region. Ladies and gentlemen, despite Montenegro's important achievements in a relatively short period of time, the global reality paints a contrasting picture. In this crucial year, which is marking the 75th anniversary of this institution, dedicated to setting benchmarks in human rights protection and promotion, we face international conflicts highlighting complex challenges which are confronting the global community. From the very day one of my presidency, I was clear of the foreign policy pillars of Montenegro, including the acceleration of the country's EU integration, strengthening credibility of our NATO membership, fostering good neighborly relations, and strengthening the role of Montenegro within multilateral initiatives. And we have all witnessed, unfortunately, to an unprovoked Russian aggression against Ukraine. And let me commend the Council of Europe on a swift and proper reaction by showing unity in case of this unprecedented crisis and standing firmly in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. And Reykjavik summit of the last year represented a historic opportunity to restate this strong message of support that we all have shown for Ukraine and its people. Unfortunately, this is not the only conflict that poses a challenge for the entire international community. The ongoing war crisis in the Middle East highlights the imperative for swift actions and the persistent search for solutions to bring back peace. Montenegro deeply regrets for the loss of lives, both during the Hamas terrorist attack in Israel, as well as in the subsequent bombing of civilian facilities in the Gaza Strip. We are persistent in promoting dialogue on regional and international levels in order to bring back peace to the region. Montenegro was among the countries that supported humanitarian ceasefire in the war between Israel and Hamas at the United Nations General Assembly. The resolution called for an immediate ceasefire, asking for the assistance to be sent urgently to the Gaza Strip, including the restoration of access to water and electricity. Ladies and gentlemen, Montenegro is committed to being a constructive voice in the international community, devoted in taking part in all possible actions to ease the consequences of these conflicts, particularly for the most vulnerable groups. Our dedication extends to doing everything within our capacity of a small nation to contribute to the restoration of peace in the world. Dear friends, in conclusion, as we reflect on the progress and challenges both within Montenegro and on the global stage, it becomes evident that peace is not only a lofty aspiration, but a collective responsibility of all of us. And as we navigate the complexities of our international and interconnected world, it is upon us to recognize that the values of democracy, the rule of law, and human rights are not just regional aspirations, but universal imperatives. In navigating these shared challenges, let us remain committed to the principles embodied by the Council of Europe. Let our actions be a testament to our dedication to a world where justice, peace, and respect for human rights prevail. Finally, my visit today to the Council of Europe is also an opportunity to express gratitude on behalf of the people of Montenegro for the continuous expertise and support this esteemed organization through all its bodies, such as the Venice Commission, Greco, and others, has provided to our democratic development. This has been particularly important for our country's path towards the full membership and full integration into the European Union. I thank you very much for your attention.
Mr. President, thank you very much for your most interesting address. Members of the Assembly have questions to put to you. We will first hear questions from the speakers on behalf of the political groups and then hear a response from Mr. Milatovic to those questions. Please, will the speakers limit their intervention to 30 seconds? Colleagues should be asking questions and not making speeches. The first on the list is, on behalf of the Social Democrats and Greens, Madame Marietta Karamanli. Madame Karamanli, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, au nom du groupe des socialistes, démocrates et verts, nous vous félicitons de votre venue devant l'Assemblée parlementaire du Conseil de l'Europe, et ce, comme nouveau chef de l'État de Monténégro. Nous espérons vivement que les valeurs qui animent l'Assemblée parlementaire du Conseil de l'Europe seront les vôtres tout au long de votre mandat. De nombreux citoyens monténégrins et européens espèrent un apaisement politique dans la région et l'avènement des forces politiques attachées à une Europe forte, efficace et solidaire. Le processus d'adhésion à l'Union européenne a débuté il y a 13 ans. Votre pays reste confronté à des défis comme la réalisation d'un système juridictionnel fonctionnel, la lutte contre la corruption et un développement économique durable. Se pose aussi la question des relations de Monténégro avec ses voisins des Balkans. Des prises de position très nationalistes ou parfois pro-russes ou refusant l'indépendance du Kosovo des partis politiques composant la majorité actuelle du Parlement monténégrin peuvent susciter des interrogations. Nous voudrions connaître donc la façon dont vous envisagez l'évolution des communautés de langues et des religions différentes au sein de votre pays et nous souhaiterions voir comment le Monténégro entend répondre à ces différents enjeux, que ce soit les conditions posées pour entrer dans l'Union européenne, à la construction de relations stables entre les États de la région. Nous vous remercions vraiment de votre réponse.
Mr. President, would you like to respond?
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Mrs. Karamanli, for your question. As I already mentioned, and I also in my speech provided a number of facts that have been happening and that are part of the political reality in Montenegro following the political change which happened in 2020, including the strengthening of the judiciary system, which is a precondition and the basis for the further progress of the country towards its European path. As you rightly said, Montenegro has started its EU accession as a candidate country back in 2009. Montenegro has started negotiations with the EU back in 2012, and now, following 11 years of negotiations, Montenegro is still negotiating. We are a front runner among all the candidate countries, and everything that I have said, including the strengthening of the judiciary, firstly through the cleaning of the judiciary from some of the people that are according to the international reports, including the data that we as a country got from the Europol, were, instead of being part of the system which is supposed to be fighting organized crime and corruption, were actually part of the organized crime and corruption. So that was the first step that was taken to remove some of those people from the system. And I think that the second step, which now is being pursued, is to find a political consensus in the parliament, which, according to the constitution of Montenegro, is asking for the qualified majority of the 2/3 to be found in the parliament in order to appoint the new people with integrity at the highest positions in the judiciary system. And that's something that I was already mentioning in my speech, something which is currently happening in the country with the establishment of the full house of the Constitutional Court, election of the full house within the Judicial Council, the body which is in charge of selecting the judges, and finally, hopefully by the end of this month, election of the new head of the state prosecutorial office. All those things have strengthened the trust of the people, or even restored the trust of the people in the judiciary, which has been very weak over the last few decades. And that was the necessary part which was needed to be taken, particularly related to the chapters 23 and 24 of the EU negotiating process, and are a cornerstone for everything else. Technically speaking, and this is now sort of also connected with our European future, once we have made the progress, as I mentioned already, in the issues related to the rule of law, there are a number of chapters that are more economic, more technical, that are currently being ready to be closed. And this is something that we as a country are aiming to do in the next few years, hoping to do everything which is on our side to be done by the end of 2026, and hopefully to become the fully fledged member of the European Union by 2028, which would also coincide with the new budgetary framework of the European Union. I must say that if there is one positive thing in the tragedy which is happening following the Russian aggression on Ukraine, is that there was a more clear understanding from Brussels, as well as from a number of other European capitals, that the neighborhood policy is a crucial policy for the European security. So what we are also seeing over the last 2 years is that the accession has become more of a political, as well as naturally a technical thing, and that's a good thing. I believe that the European Union also needs a positive story to tell to the other candidate countries, and I am absolutely certain that that positive story indeed can and should be Montenegro. In that regard, the European Union and all its member states could show to the rest of the candidate countries that the reforms that are sometimes hard, but are being taken in Montenegro, are paying off.
Elvira Kovacs will ask the next question on behalf of the APP Group.
Thank you. Dobar dan, gospodine predsjedniče. Distinguished Mr. President, EU enlargement is indeed a two-way street, but after such a long time, it is obvious that the Western Balkans' enthusiasm and spirit was somehow lost. And the time passed with insufficient engagement and without a sufficient effect. As you said, and we all know, that Montenegro has opened all of the chapters but closed only 3. But it still seems that a lot of work still awaits. Therefore, not only for Montenegro, overall in the region, one of the important tasks is the renewal of the somehow lost integration enthusiasm. In your opinion, it's good that you spoke about your country, but what do you think? What kind of new concept is needed for Western Balkan countries, for the neighborhood? Thank you.
Mr. President.
Well, thank you very much for the question. I think that, you know, as I already said, there is a new momentum in Brussels about the enlargement, and that's a positive thing. And I think that it is very much appreciated that the European Commission came with the growth plan for the Western Balkans as presented by the Madam President of the European Commission, Mrs. von der Leyen, which is consisted of 4 pillars. The first one being the one related to the accession of the region into the single European market. The second one being related to the regional integration of the region itself. The third one being related to the more structural funds that can be put at the disposal for the development of the region. And the fourth one, which is probably the most crucial one, is everything which is related to the reforms that the region needs to do in order to pursue steps ahead. I believe that when it comes to the rest of the region, probably the biggest push for the region would be one positive story, which is Montenegro. And this is indeed something that I'm often saying also to the European leaders. Sometimes in some of the other countries of the Western Balkans, there is sort of a skepticism about the European future. Because if you remember, the last country which entered the EU was Croatia back in 2013. So the enlargement didn't happen over the last 11 years already, while in the meantime, United Kingdom also left the European Union. So I'm absolutely certain that with one positive example that can indeed be the one of Montenegro, the public confidence about the optimism of the European future of the region can indeed be restored.
On behalf of the European Conservatives, is now the turn of Zsolt Nemes.
Sorry, Mr. Tsilki.
Sorry, it's Mr. Tsilki has been informed.
Mr. President, the Council of Europe will celebrate the 75th anniversary of its foundation this year. In your view, what political lessons can we draw from the past of the organization to be ready to deal with the challenges of the future? Hungary is one of the strongest supporters of EU's enlargement policy. Therefore, we are committed to strengthening the European perspective of the Western Balkans. Thank you.
Mr. President, you have the floor.
Thank you. I think that in order to answer that question, one should probably go back to the reasons why the Council of Europe was established back in 1948. And the principles that were about to be pursued by the member states of this institution, including democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, have been there for a number of years. But the crucial lesson that we have all learned is that democratic development is not a one-way street. And this has become obvious, particularly following the Russian aggression on Ukraine. Democracy is not a one-way street. It is something that needs to be cherished on a daily basis, where institutions such as the Council of Europe have had and still have a great deal of work to do in that regard. And that's, in my opinion, the biggest lesson learned that we have seen over the last few years. Thank you.
Madame Liliana Tanguy, on behalf of ALDE.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Votre Excellence, votre pays est le membre du Conseil de l'Europe depuis 2007 et a entamé des négociations d'adhésion à l'Union européenne depuis 2012. Le Monténégro a déjà réalisé des progrès très importants. Il est le seul candidat à avoir ouvert tous les chapitres de négociation. Il est aligné sur la politique étrangère de sécurité commune de l'Union européenne. Le Monténégro est clairement aujourd'hui le pays candidat le plus proche de l'adhésion. Notre groupe politique s'est félicité de la victoire des libéraux aux élections de juin 2023 et espère que l'actuelle coalition gouvernementale parviendra à rester solide et unie pour être en capacité de relancer de manière décisive le processus d'adhésion à l'Union européenne. Courant 2024, le gouvernement accueillera en son sein des membres de la coalition Za budućnost Crne Gore. Le Monténégro peut-il, dans ces conditions, maintenir le cap des réformes dans le domaine de la justice, de l'administration publique, la lutte contre la corruption et le crime organisé? Monsieur le Président, êtes-vous optimiste quant au maintien de l'unité politique du pays en 2024, qui est une condition indispensable pour faire avancer le Monténégro sur le chemin de l'adhésion à l'Union européenne? Je vous remercie.
Mr. President, would you like to respond?
I think it's a very important question, and I think that when I said that the elections in Montenegro are not anymore the question of life and death, but the opportunity for the people to democratically choose, this is indeed what currently is happening in Montenegro, which, as you all know here, is not really the case in many countries across the globe. For the first time in our history, which is very long and we are very proud of it, Montenegro has changed its government in the elections in 2020. Now, we already have the third government in place. And again, to repeat, what I believe now has become the focus of a truly vivid democracy, which currently is being in Montenegro, is institutional stability. Because in every democracy, in every free society, governments come and go. And they are a result of a democratic choice of the people at the free elections. But what is indeed important are the institutions that are independent and stable enough to push the country ahead with the reforms that are being needed. This is indeed what we are observing in Montenegro over the last few years, and especially following the formation of the current Assembly of the Parliament, which has delivered on a number of things that the former assemblies of the Parliament were not able to deliver, including the full house of the Constitutional Court, the full house of the Judicial Council, hopefully the election of the state prosecutor, the election of the central bank governor, etc., etc. And those are all the facts that speak for itself. In that regard, I am optimistic that the country is on a stable and sustainable path towards a speedier convergence, both in terms of the reforms as well as economic standards and the rule of law vis-à-vis the European Union. My belief is that the country, if we continue in this way, we can complete what is on our side, as I said already, by 2026, by the end of 2026, leaving 2027 for the ratification of the accession agreement by the parliaments of the member states, so that Montenegro, perhaps at one point in 2028, can become a fully fledged member state of the European Union. To remind you, we are the smallest out of all the candidate countries, of the size of 600,000 people. We are the most economically advanced, with the standard of living at about 60% of the EU average. We are fully aligning the foreign policy with the one of the EU. The country has been the member of NATO since 2017, and the country is using euro since 2001, and the country is the only one which has opened all the negotiating chapters and hopefully will be able to also in 2024 close a number of them. So yes, in short, I'm an optimist. Thank you.
On behalf of the United European Left, Mr. Marco Nicolini.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. President, Montenegro's accession process is coming to an end, and almost all the negotiation chapters with the European Union have been opened. It is a very important moment of transition also for another small European country, the one that I represent here in this Assembly, the Republic of San Marino. Given that last December, after 8 years of negotiation, the Executive Vice President Maroš Šefčovič, the Foreign Minister of the Republic of San Marino, Luca Beccari, and the Head of Government of the Principality of Andorra, Xavier Expot, officially announced the success of the negotiation aiming at stipulating an association with the European Union. Your country is much larger than ours, but it is considered a small state in Europe, and what I ask you, Mr. President, is to possibly enhance the beliefs that this choice will lead the two small countries to escape from an isolation that in the 21st century no one can stand anymore. Thank you very much.
Mr. President.
Well, I cannot speak on behalf of San Marino, but I can obviously speak on behalf of Montenegro, and the aspiration to join the European family has been the cornerstone of the foreign policy of Montenegro ever since we became independent in 2006. I truly believe that not only Montenegro's accession into the EU, but the accession of the whole region, and perhaps also of the countries such as yours, is the way towards the more stable and prosperous European continent. This is what I have already mentioned. This is something that I believe has perhaps been forgotten a bit over the last few years, but I think that the wake-up call that happened following the Russian aggression in Ukraine is indeed obvious. And this is something that we all need to recognize.
Thank you, Mr. President. Now I'm going to change a little bit the procedure. Mr. President, I would like to ask you to take some notes because I'm going to give the floor to the 5 first speakers, so you will have the ability to answer to them all afterwards. The first is Monsieur Alain Milon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président du Monténégro, le recensement de la population de votre pays, organisé le 3 décembre dernier, avait une dimension très politique, puisque la population était invitée à déclarer son appartenance communautaire et sa langue maternelle. Cette opération était suivie de près, évidemment, par la Serbie, le président serbe ayant déclaré que ce recensement représentait un intérêt vital pour la Serbie. La question de l'apprentissage à l'école et de l'usage officiel de la langue serbe pouvant être réévaluée à l'issue de ce recensement. Quelles conséquences politiques et institutionnelles le Monténégro entend-il tirer du résultat de ce recensement?
Thank you. The second colleague on the list is Mrs. Boyarka Illes. I hope that I pronounce it well. I'm not sure. So now we're going to Mr. Thomas Hassler.
Ja, herzlichen Dank, Herr Vorsitzender, für das Wort. Ich danke auch Herrn Präsidenten Milatovic für seine Ausführungen. Freie und unabhängige Medien sind für das Funktionieren jeder Demokratie unabdingbar. Es ist daher von kritischer Wichtigkeit, Journalisten und Medienschaffenden in ihrer Arbeit nicht zu behindern und gegenteilige Aktionen zu schützen. Sie sind heute schon sehr generell auf dieses Thema eingegangen. Können Sie vielleicht noch ein bisschen näher erläutern, welche Maßnahmen Montenegro ergreift, um dies sicherzustellen?
Next is Mrs. Bilali Zendeli Arta.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear Your Excellency, Mr. Milatovic, we are coming from the same region with similar history, similar challenges, and hopefully a joint future. As a young and prosperous politician or leader, what would be your recommendation to other leaders in the Western Balkans, especially to those who have open questions, who blocks each other, and who opposites each other? Thank you.
Thank you. The next in the list is Mr. Rafael Husseinov. Is Mr. Husseinov here? No, it seems like it's the lucky day of Damien Cotier. Mr. Cotier.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'm one of the two co-rapporteurs of the monitoring committee of this assembly on Montenegro, and your country has been in a post-monitoring dialogue since 2015. And I want to congratulate the country for the progress made in the recent weeks or months, because we have been quite impatient in this assembly to see progress in the four main topics that the monitoring report was pointing. It's the reform of the judicial system, it's the protection of journalists, it's the fight against corruption, and it's the electoral reform. So you have brought good news about some of these issues. Do you see the political will in your country and in the parliament to find the majorities to pursue these efforts, because they are really needed for this assembly in the perspective of its next report on the post-monitoring dialogue? Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. And the last on the list is Mrs. Andrea Eder-Gitzthaler.
Mein Heimatland Österreich hat ihren EU-Beitritt ja immer sehr stark unterstützt, versucht zu helfen, Brücken zu bauen, schon aufgrund unserer gemeinsamen Historie. Daher freut es mich, dass Sie heute berichtet haben, dass auch schon eine echte demokratische Entwicklung in den letzten 2 Jahren stattgefunden hat und dass Sie schon sehr weit sind in der Erfüllung der Kriterien, die notwendig sind, wirtschaftlich und politisch, wie Rechtsstaatlichkeit, Einhaltung der Menschenrechte, Achtung und Schutz der Minderheiten. Vielleicht können Sie dann noch sagen, wie weit Sie da sind bei der Erfüllung der Kriterien. Und was mir ganz wichtig ist, welche Maßnahmen setzen Sie, um jungen Menschen eine gute Perspektive in ihrem Land zu bieten und Älteren einen sorgenfreien und guten Lebensabend?
Thank you so much. So, Mr. President, would you like to respond to the questions?
Yes, thank you very much. I think that 5 questions that I have been asked are very important. Going back to the first one, the question on census. The last time Montenegro had census was 2011, and we were supposed to have one in 2021. However, due to the COVID, it was postponed for a year or 2. From the very beginning, I had a very clear opinion of what the census is, and the census is a statistical question. A statistical question implemented by the Statistical Office of Montenegro that has a full trust of the Eurostat and a full trust of the people in Montenegro of its ability to implement a good census. I do want to say that I'm very happy that there was a good result of the dialogue about the census between the current government and the opposition, and as a result of which the census has started at the beginning of December. I expect that the census, as in every other country of the world, shows the facts. So whatever the facts are, they should be there as a result of the census. And as a key statistical report for the country, it is absolutely a very crucial starting point for making smarter decisions going forward. I think that the census has been very often portrayed unnecessarily by the focus on one or two questions, while some of the other important facts that we are going to get from the census are usually being missed, including to understand how many people Montenegro currently has, how many young people, relating to the question that one of the MPs asked, currently we have in Montenegro, what are the opportunities for them to stay in Montenegro, etc., etc. In that regard, my position is very clear. On the media question, so I want to mention 4 things. Number one is that when it comes to the legislation and the legislative framework, I believe that as in all the other areas, it is being fully aligned with the EU acquis. And in that regard, we have done a good job over the last few years. What we have done also in 2021 or 2022, we have changed the criminal code in the way that now the profession of the journalists have been envisioned to have a further legal protection by the criminal code, which was also something praised by the Council of Europe as well as the European Union. On the media freedom, I would like to report and to inform the Parliamentary Assembly that according to the report of the Reporters Without Borders, the latest one from 2023, the media freedom improved in Montenegro, so the country has jumped from the 63rd place to the 39th, which is a big improvement reflecting all the legislative as well as institutional changes put in place over the last few years. There is a challenge when it comes to the unresolved cases that are related to the attacks, even a murder on a journalist in the former years. And that's something where I expect now, with all the new people that I have already mentioned being put in place within our judiciary system, that there are going to be some more tangible results from some of the cases that are even now 20 years long. On the question on the political will to pursue efforts on reforms, I think that everything that I have already mentioned in my speech points towards the facts that there has been a political will. There has been a political will also in the parliament where Montenegro, with the current assembly of the parliament, got to the stage where democracy is understood not only as a matter of the numbers and something which is bigger than something else, but also of the understanding that you need to find a compromise and that you need to put yourself in the shoes of the other party. As I already mentioned several times here, we are seeing some of the deliveries over the last few months that we haven't been able to deliver as a society through the parliament over the last 4 or 5 years. So, as a conclusion, yes, there is definitely a political will. And I believe that there is a political will both from the position as well as from parts of the opposition in the current assembly of the parliament. On the young people and their perspective to stay in Montenegro, there are 2 factors that are predominantly determining the choice of a young people to stay or to leave. Meritocracy in terms of entering the labor market, and this is something that definitely needs to be further strengthened, both when it comes to the public administration as well as the state-owned enterprises, in order to make sure that the best of the people stay in the country by taking the jobs for which they are qualified and educated. And the second are the salaries. I have already mentioned in my speech some of the economic reforms that have been put in place, including the fiscal reforms, the reforms in the labor market that have led to the increase of the minimum wage, to the increase of the average salaries, and which is obviously helping also the young people to have higher incentives to stay in Montenegro. And I think strengthening those two aspects, meritocracy as well as economic growth, is the way forward. And ultimately, answering the question from the colleague from the North Macedonia on the advice, everything that I have spoken about today in front of the Parliamentary Assembly is the advice that I have to the rest of the region. I think that ultimately the region needs to strive towards the speedier accession towards the EU, and the way to do that is to speed up the reforms. Montenegro is doing it, and I am very much hopeful that the other countries in the region are also doing it. I think that the stability of the Balkans and prosperity of the Balkans is in the European Union.
Mr. President of Montenegro, it was an honor to have you here and listen to your wise advice. And that brings us to the end of the questioning of our esteemed colleagues. On behalf of the Assembly, I want to thank you most warmly for your address and for the answers given to the questions. Thank you so much. Dear colleagues, I want to remind you that voting is open for the election of Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights and 3 judges to the European Court of Human Rights in respect of Bulgaria, Lithuania, and Luxembourg. The votes will close at 6 p.m. So I invite those of you who have not yet voted to do so.
Dear colleagues, the next item on the agenda is the debate on the report titled Recent Developments in the Middle East, Hamas terroristic attack on Israel and Israel's response, presented by Mr. Piero Fassino on behalf of the Committee of Political Affairs and Democracy. In order to finish by 6:45 p.m., I will interrupt the list of speakers at about 6 p.m. to allow time for the reply and vote on the draft resolution. I call Mr. Fassino, rapporteur. You have 7 minutes now and 3 minutes at the end to reply to the debate. The floor is yours, Mr. Fassino.
Grazie, signor Presidente. Considerata la delicatezza della materia, parlerò in italiano. Da 100 giorni il mondo assiste con angoscia alla gravissima crisi che ha investito il 7 ottobre il Medio Oriente. Una crisi innescata da Hamas che il 7 ottobre ha invaso i territori israeliani, confinanti con la striscia di Gaza, sterminando intere famiglie, facendo strage di giovani che assistevano a un concerto, devastando kibbutz, violentando in modo efferato giovani ragazze e madri di famiglia e sequestrando e deportando oltre 200 persone, 130 delle quali tuttora ostaggi di Hamas. E vorrei anzitutto esprimere la nostra solidarietà alle famiglie delle vittime e degli ostaggi. Un massacro che non può essere giustificato in alcun modo, né può essere giustificato invocando l'occupazione israeliana della Cisgiordania, il cui status attuale, è bene ricordarlo, è stato definito con gli accordi sottoscritti tra Israele e Autorità Nazionale Palestinese. Di fronte al massacro Israele ha reagito entrando nella striscia di Gaza con un'azione militare, con massicci bombardamenti aerei e combattimenti di terra finalizzati al duplice obiettivo di liberare gli ostaggi e distruggere le strutture di Hamas. Questo intervento ha provocato continui spostamenti degli oltre 2 milioni di abitanti di Gaza che vivono in una condizione di grande precarietà, in tendopoli di emergenza, con aiuti alimentari insufficienti, con strutture sanitarie inadeguate. E ha colpito l'opinione pubblica mondiale il numero di oltre 25.000 vittime, tra cui molte donne, bambini e anziani, una quantità che parte della comunità internazionale giudica sproporzionata. Anche se va ricordato che ha concorso a quell'alto numero di vittime la strategia di Hamas di trasformare il territorio di Gaza in una base militare costruendo nel sottosuolo una gigantesca rete di tunnel, gallerie sotto scuole, ospedali, moschee, uffici e abitazioni. In questi 100 giorni si sono avute fragili e brevi tregue che hanno consentito scambi tra ostaggi e detenuti palestinesi. Ciò tuttavia non ha ridotto l'asprezza della guerra, che anzi conosce il rischio di un allargamento, con le iniziative di Hezbollah sul confine israelo-libanese, con il lancio di missili degli Houthi yemeniti e con la regia del regime di Teheran. In questo periodo la Corte internazionale di giustizia, su iniziativa del Sudafrica, ha aperto un procedimento contro Israele accusato del crimine di genocidio, accusa respinta da Israele. E appare quantomeno curioso che nessuna indagine fino ad oggi sia stata aperta sui massacri di Hamas. Di fronte a questo quadro critico si è sviluppata una forte iniziativa internazionale per la liberazione degli ostaggi, per fermare le armi e aprire la strada a una soluzione politica. Particolarmente attivi gli Stati Uniti, con un impegno diretto del Presidente Biden e una presenza continua nella regione del Segretario di Stato Blinken. Le Nazioni Unite e il suo Segretario Generale hanno ripetutamente sollecitato l'allentamento delle ostilità militari, la liberazione degli ostaggi e la facilitazione dell'inoltro degli aiuti umanitari. Il Consiglio di sicurezza ha adottato non senza travaglio una risoluzione in questa direzione. Anche l'Unione Europea si è attivata per favorire il superamento della crisi, proponendo la convocazione di una conferenza internazionale di pace. Nonostante tutto ciò, la guerra continua e dunque occorre accelerare la ricerca di una soluzione politica, obiettivo che deve perseguire anche la nostra Assemblea. In primo luogo ci deve essere la liberazione degli ostaggi, richiesta a gran voce dalle famiglie e da una sempre più larga opinione pubblica israeliana, come si è visto ancora nelle grandi manifestazioni dei giorni scorsi. In secondo luogo occorre arrivare presto a un cessate il fuoco, almeno temporaneo, che faciliti la liberazione degli ostaggi, consenta il ritorno dei palestinesi alle loro abitazioni, favorisca l'inoltro degli aiuti umanitari e consenta di verificare la possibilità di riaprire la strada alla soluzione due popoli, due Stati. Questa soluzione appare l'unica possibile perché in quella terra vivono due diritti: il diritto di Israele a vivere riconosciuto e sicuro e il diritto dei palestinesi ad avere una patria, diritti entrambi legittimi e che devono essere entrambi riconosciuti. È una soluzione tuttavia non priva di ostacoli. Il primo ministro Netanyahu ha reiterato più volte la sua contrarietà alla creazione di uno Stato palestinese e invece per negoziare un accordo occorre una leadership che lo voglia fare. L'ANP è debole e minata da divisioni e anche su questo fronte serve un rinnovamento della leadership. Rimane irrisolto il tema di chi, almeno transitoriamente, dovrà gestire Gaza. E in ogni caso, di fronte a un accordo tra Israele e ANP, è prevedibile che Hamas continuerebbe la sua attività perseguendo la distruzione di Israele e invocando, come fa ogni giorno, un'unica Palestina da Gerusalemme al mare. A questo quadro critico concorre anche in Cisgiordania l'attività aggressiva e violenta di gruppi di coloni verso villaggi palestinesi, attività che chiediamo alle autorità israeliane di contrastare con fermezza. Infine, l'emozione suscitata dalle tante vittime della guerra ha portato a manifestazioni contro Israele, spesso con slogan antisemiti, antisionisti e antiebraici. Sono atteggiamenti inaccettabili che vanno contrastati con grande fermezza, ben consapevoli di quante tragedie l'antisemitismo ha provocato nella storia europea e nel mondo. Così come vanno contrastate manifestazioni di islamofobia, evitando l'errore di assimilare i palestinesi ad Hamas. Concludendo, cari colleghi, serve una forte iniziativa internazionale per fermare la guerra, ottenere la liberazione degli ostaggi, restituire Gaza a una vita civile e aprire la strada a una soluzione politica. Anche la nostra Assemblea è chiamata a fare la propria parte, intensificando la cooperazione con la Knesset e il Consiglio legislativo palestinese e promuovendo soprattutto la cooperazione tra loro. Vi ringrazio dell'attenzione e vi invito a sostenere la risoluzione che abbiamo presentato a nome della Commissione politica. Grazie.
Thank you, Mr. Fassino. In the debate, I call first Mr. Pablo Hispan on behalf of EPP. The floor is yours.
Yes.
3 minutes.
Thank you, Mrs. President. The terrorist attacks by Hamas on October 7th against the people of Israel has been one of the most horrendous aggressions against the peace that humanity has suffered in the last 2 decades. In addition, for the hundreds of victims who were killed, today, while we are speaking, there are hundreds of innocents who are still as hostages of Hamas. The terrorists knew what they were doing. They knew the damage they were going to cause to the people of Israel, but they also knew the consequences that these actions would take for the people of Palestine. They committed terrible crimes, knowing the enormous suffering that would cause to their own people in Gaza and to Israel. Today, we have known the death of more than 20 Israeli soldiers. There is no one more responsible for what is happening in Gaza today than Hamas and their supporters. Its stated purpose is the annihilation of the State of Israel and the murder of Jewish people at Nikos, also in Palestinian lives. Unfortunately, the worst is yet to come. We are currently watching an escalation of violence never seen before in the Middle East. An escalation which Russia is taking advantage of by instigating a division of Western democracies' commitment with the defense and the integrity of Ukraine. However, this escalation requires for an external collaboration, Iran, whose military actions deeply destabilize the region. On the other hand, another of the essential freedoms necessary for the development of our way of living, which also defines of Western values, is the freedom of the seas, which also is being attacked by Houthi terrorists. We are facing a turning point in history, and the decisions we make today are going to determine the future of years to come. Therefore, my group supports Fassino's report, not only because it strongly condemns the attack against the State of Israel, but also because it demands the release of the hostages and calls for aid for Palestinian people. There will be not a solid solution and lasting peace in the Middle East if Middle East countries do not recognize Israel as a state. Let's all condemn the attack against Israel. Let's condemn the anti-Semitism that has risen in Europe, especially in the left, and let's condemn all those who support and legitimize or justify the terrorists by Hamas as do members of the Spanish government. This will be the best plan to achieve peace in the Middle East and for the Palestinian people to finally live among internationally recognized borders. This future state must be a consequence of a peace process, never a reward of a terrorist attack or an excuse to damage on the people of Israel, a people who should only be seen as victims, as well as the Palestinians who condemn Hamas terrorist actions. Thank you, Mr. Fassino, for your work and experience that you have put in play in this report. Thank you.
Thank you. On behalf of the European Conservatives, I give the floor to Lord Blanchard. The floor is yours.
Madam President, I congratulate the rapporteur, Mr. Fassino, on a very well-balanced and excellent report. It is so right to denounce the absolute horror of the massacre of the 1,200 civilian innocents. It was the most evil and bloodthirsty crime in living memory, and no one with a shred of decency can justify it. The report rightly calls the killings barbaric and the worst genocide of Jews since the Second World War. The Israeli response has been proportionate in the face of rape and killing of their sons, daughters and children. The rules of war are clear, that where the enemy hide themselves in hospitals and civilian houses, then, unfortunately, those civilian structures are liable to be attacked. So the blame for civilian casualties in Gaza lies solely with Hamas and not Israel. Hamas started this war by attacking innocent Israelis from civilian areas in Gaza and military tunnels under hospitals packed full with guns and rockets. Inevitably, Gaza civilians will be killed as Israel defends itself, which it has the right to do. And we need to be sceptical about the Hamas terrorist Ministry of Health figures for civilian casualties, which may be grossly exaggerated. Of course, about 12,000 of these so-called civilians are actually Hamas terrorists themselves. Mr. Fassino calls for the release of hostages, which is essential, and for a ceasefire. However, we need to be absolutely clear that the hostages must be released first, and then a ceasefire is possible. But there must be no ceasefire which will give Hamas more time to rearm and renew their evil attacks. So I do understand Israel wanting to neutralise the terrorist attacks before letting their guns go silent, which we all want to see. Mr. Fassino also comments on the fact that some countries have banned pro-Palestinian demonstrations and suggests a need to keep legitimate freedom of speech and protest. However, I am appalled to see in my country, the United Kingdom, demonstrations calling for the destruction of Israel and the de facto extermination of Jews in a new Holocaust. The chant, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," can only mean free of Jews and no Israel. I call on the United Kingdom police forces to arrest and charge all those chanting that. And there were placards showing Israel being pushed into the sea. Most of the demonstrations I see in my country are to destroy Israel rather than save Gaza. And it was instructive that the 3,000 Hamas terrorists who massacred the Israelis were shouting Allahu Akbar and not Free Palestine. Colleagues, let us bear in mind that Israel is the only genuinely democratic country in the region, and it is under attack from all sides. Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, Yemen, and these terrorist organizations are also getting funding from other Arab countries in the region. 80 years ago, there was an attempt to exterminate all Jews. We must ensure that a different enemy does not succeed this time. Thank you.
Thank you. In the debate, I call next Madame Clapeau on behalf of ALDE.
Madame la Présidente, Monsieur le rapporteur, cher Piero Fassino, chers collègues, depuis le 7 octobre, un cycle de violence extrême se déchaîne en Israël et en Palestine. Le Hamas a commis des actes de terrorisme contre Israël, des attaques odieuses et barbares contre des civils, tuant et prenant en otage des personnes de tous âges, israéliens ou d'autres nationalités, commettant des violences sexuelles et causant 1200 morts. Ces actes doivent être condamnés avec force et ne pas rester impunis. Plus d'une centaine d'otages sont encore dans les mains du Hamas. Ils doivent être libérés sans délai. C'est une condition préalable à tout règlement du conflit et à l'apaisement de la situation dans la région. Face à cette attaque terroriste, Israël a le droit de se défendre contre le Hamas, mais dans le respect du droit humanitaire international. La population palestinienne ne doit pas être confondue avec le Hamas. Au contraire, elle est aussi sa victime et hélas devenue son bouclier humain. Israël ne peut se défaire de ses obligations de protéger les civils palestiniens et les humanitaires. C'est là l'honneur des démocraties et des États de droit. Or, la riposte d'Israël et l'escalade de la violence visent de manière systématique et indiscriminée la population palestinienne. Le siège de la bande de Gaza qui bloque l'acheminement de l'eau, de la nourriture, de l'énergie, des médicaments est une tragédie humanitaire inqualifiable. Les besoins humanitaires sont à un niveau sans précédent. À ce blocus, il faut ajouter les bombardements incessants visant aussi bien le nord que le sud de la bande de Gaza. Tout bombardement d'infrastructures ou des populations civiles est une violation du droit international. Et le bilan, hélas, serait de plus de 24 000 morts à Gaza. Face à cela, notre position doit être claire et entendue par tous, au premier rang Israël. La lutte contre le terrorisme est légitime, mais la punition collective et indiscriminée contre la population civile palestinienne ne peut pas l'être. C'est aussi vrai en Cisjordanie, où les violences de la part de colons israéliens se multiplient, en particulier contre les travailleurs gazaouis. Nous ne pouvons accepter un double standard en matière de protection des civils et du droit humanitaire. Chaque vie palestinienne et israélienne compte. Notre voix, celle du Conseil de l'Europe, celle des nations européennes que nous représentons, est attendue. Il nous faut demander à travers cette résolution l'arrêt immédiat des hostilités, un cessez-le-feu et l'ouverture permanente d'un accès humanitaire. Il nous faut aussi continuer de travailler avec nos partenaires de la Knesset et du Conseil national palestinien pour promouvoir par la diplomatie parlementaire la coopération entre chaque peuple et la protection de leurs droits reconnus par des instruments internationaux. Ce travail est nécessaire pour créer les bases d'un dialogue entre les différentes parties prenantes pour, à terme, instaurer les conditions de négociation et d'établissement d'une solution à deux États. Cette perspective doit rester un horizon pour la communauté internationale, pour les peuples israéliens et palestiniens, afin de pouvoir vivre en paix dans le respect de leurs droits à l'autodétermination, à la sécurité et à la liberté.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to Mr. Gavan on behalf of the European Left.
Thank you, Madam President. On behalf of the United European Left, I want to express our profound concern at much of the content of this report. We, of course, condemn the actions of Hamas, and we insist on the release of all hostages on all sides. But the resolution as currently framed simply does not reflect the horrors of what is happening in occupied Palestine. According to the United Nations, in the first 100 days, Israel's military offensive has resulted in the loss of over 23,000 lives, 75% are estimated to be women and children, with more than 7,000 more missing under the rubble. More than 53,000 wounded, over 1,000 children suffering amputations, many of those amputations carried out without anaesthetic. The displacement of over 85% of the population, amounting to 1.9 million civilians. The deliberate massive destruction of Gaza in terms of all of its infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, places of worship and refugee camps. The lack of water and food leading to starvation even as we debate this today. And then there is the language used by the leaders of the Israeli government. In October, President Herzog said, "It's an entire nation out there that is responsible. We will fight until we break their backbone." Minister of Defence declared, "Gaza won't return to what it was before. We will eliminate everything." Deputy Speaker of the Knesset, Nissim Vaturi, stated, "Now we all have one common goal, erasing the Gaza Strip from the face of the earth." In the words of the great Jewish writer Gideon Levy, if all of this does not constitute genocide, then what is it? How do we describe it? At the very least, it constitutes collective punishment of the Palestinian people, which is in itself a war crime. The report in its current form has no direct condemnation of Israel, and I have to ask, how can this be? 11,000 children have been slaughtered in 11 weeks by Israeli occupying forces. Are we really not willing to condemn this? What kind of human rights body would choose to ignore this? The most important call that any of us can make is the call for a permanent and unconditional ceasefire. And in this regard, I want to recognise the work of our colleague Sevin Dagdalen, who is a co-founder of Parliamentarians for a Ceasefire, which now constitutes more than 500 parliamentarians across 30 countries. We all have a duty to make this demand now, and there must be accountability, not only for the murderous actions of the apartheid Israeli state, but also for the enablers of genocide, those states that supply the weapons and bombs to allow it to happen. And in this regard, I want to call out in particular the actions of the British Conservative government. To conclude, we need an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. We need an end to the illegal occupation of Palestine, and we need justice for the Palestinian people.
Thank you. In the debate, I call next Mr. Schwabe on behalf of the Socialist Party.
Ja, Frau Präsidentin, ich will zunächst mal Piero Fassino herzlich danken dafür, dass er diesen Bericht gemacht hat und diese schwierige Aufgabe übernommen hat in dieser schwierigen geopolitischen Lage, vielleicht der schwierigsten der Welt, weil man sich natürlich in auch beide Seiten hineinvollziehen kann, dass er diesen Bericht übernommen hat. Ich habe heute Morgen ein Interview gelesen mit Ehud Olmert, dem ehemaligen Premierminister Israels. Ich kann das nur sehr empfehlen. Es ist ein lesenswertes Interview, das deutlich macht, dass man sehr wohl das Existenzrecht Israels mit aller Kraft unterstützen kann, sehr grundsätzlich und sehr praktisch, und gleichzeitig aber eben auch nicht einverstanden sein kann mit der Politik der aktuellen israelischen Regierung. Wir reden über einen ganz grundsätzlichen Konflikt, der über Jahre, Jahrzehnte nicht gelöst wurde. Und wir sehen, was passieren kann, wenn ein solcher Konflikt über Jahre und Jahrzehnte nicht gelöst wurde. Wir reden über unterschiedliche Perspektiven auf diesen Konflikt. Und ich muss sagen, diese unterschiedlichen Perspektiven finden sich auch in meiner Fraktion wieder. Worüber Einigkeit besteht, ist, dass wir von einem unfassbaren, kriminellen, barbarischen Akt des Überfalls der Terrororganisation Hamas am 7. Oktober auf Israel reden und wir die unverzügliche Freilassung aller Geiseln fordern. Wir sind uns aber auch einig, dass es im Gazastreifen dass wir es dort mit einer dramatischen humanitären Katastrophe zu tun haben, die Menschen jetzt in diesen Minuten, da wir hier diskutieren, schrecklich leiden lässt. Frauen, Männer, Kinder mit herzzerreißenden Bildern. Es darf aber eben kein geteiltes Mitfühlen geben. Im Leid Unschuldiger gibt es keinen Unterschied. Und ich habe auch die Beschreibung im Kopf von den Angehörigen der Geiseln, die ich getroffen habe, welch unsagbares Leid auf israelischer Seite sie schildern. Wir stehen zum Existenzrecht Israels, eines Staats, in dem Jüdinnen und Juden in Sicherheit leben können. Eines übrigens demokratischen Staates, in dem man die Regierung ja auch kritisieren kann und auch demokratisch abwählen kann. Und wir stehen entschlossen gegen jede Form des Antisemitismus, der sich ekelerregend auch wieder in Europa breit macht. Wir stehen aber auch gegen jede Form der Muslimfeindlichkeit, die auch gerade wieder hochkriecht und wo manche, die sonst gar nicht so sehr auf der Seite Israels und der Jüdinnen und Juden sind, plötzlich entdecken, dass ja die Muslime schuld seien. Wir sehen weiterhin Raketenbeschuss auf Israel mit Zehntausenden Betroffenen. Wir sehen das Leid der traumatisierten Familien auch in Israel und wir fordern nochmal die Freilassung aller Geiseln. Die humanitäre Lage im Gazastreifen aber ist katastrophal. Es ist ein Verstoß gegen die Gebote der Humanität, dass so wenig Hilfe bei den Menschen ankommt. Die Berichte über das Leid der Menschen, insbesondere der Kinder, sind unerträglich. Und Israel muss alles tun, um mehr humanitäre Hilfe möglich zu machen. Eine Waffenruhe ist für eine effektive humanitäre Hilfe nötig. Mit militärischen Mitteln ist eine Terrororganisation, so sehr es verständlich ist, dass sie eingesetzt werden, am Ende nicht zu besiegen. Es braucht eine Zwei-Staaten-Lösung, so weit entfernt sie auch entsprechend sein mag. Wir brauchen eine sichere Zukunft für Jüdinnen und Juden, aber eben auch für Palästinenserinnen und Palästinenser. Diese Organisation darf sich nicht überschätzen, indem wir tun können. Wir haben freundschaftliche Beziehungen zu Israelis und Palästinenserinnen und Palästinensern. Wir werden den Konflikt nicht lösen können. Was wir bieten können, ist ein Ort des Dialogs. Und ich habe gelernt in dieser Debatte, dass es in der Vergangenheit häufiger so war und mehr so war, dass Delegationen aus Israel und Palästina hier auch wirklich präsent waren und mitdiskutiert haben. Und ich wünsche mir und mache das Angebot, dass wir das tun und hier diesen Ort des Dialogs pflegen können. Vielen Dank nochmal an Piero.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schwabe. We will proceed now with Ms. Ben Ari, Israel. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam President. On the morning of October 7, which fell on a Jewish holiday, thousands of Hamas and other terrorists breached Israeli sovereign territory by air, land, and sea. They invaded over 20 Israeli communities, army bases, and a site of a music festival with over 3,000 young people celebrating life and love. What proceeded under the cover of thousands of rockets fired indiscriminately into Israel was the massacre, mutilation, rape, and abduction of over 260 citizens into Gaza. The terrorists grabbed whatever they could find and then went on to shoot, rape, torture, and kidnap innocent people. In the kibbutzim, children were tortured in front of their parents and parents in front of their children. Babies and elderly, men and women were burned alive inside their homes. Over 1,200 people were butchered that day, and more than 5,500 were severely injured. The savagery of October 7 was documented by the terrorists themselves through body cam attached to their bodies. In addition, forensic evidence taken at the scene confirmed that Hamas terrorists committed acts of sexual abuse. We also know it because they proudly film it and broadcast their barbarism. This was the deadliest attack against the Jewish people in a single day since the Holocaust. We were attacked simply for being Jewish living in Israel. Johnny Simantov, a wheat farmer, and his wife Tamar, a peace activist, live in Kibbutz Nir Oz. When the rockets fired start, they hid in the safe room with their 3 young children. During the rampage, Hamas terrorists set their house on fire. Johnny texts to his sister Renee, "They are here, they are burning us." The whole family was burned alive to ashes, making it difficult to recognize them. There was nothing left. A female survivor of the Nova Music Festival massacre testified to police that she witnessed a Hamas terrorist brutally raping a young woman as another cut off her breast and toyed with it. She was finally shot in the head by a third one. In a recording of Hamas terrorists, he is heard joyfully calling his parents from Kibbutz Miflasim, and I quote, "Open my WhatsApp," he continues. "Look how many Jews I kill with my own hand, maybe 10 or more. Your son killed Jews. I'm talking to you from a Jewish woman's phone. I killed her and I killed her husband. Dad, 10 with my own hands," he shouts with glee. "Mom, your son is a hero," he says. His mother replies, and I quote, "Oh, my son, I wish I could be there with you and join you." End of quote. I wish I had the time to discuss the countless atrocities that took place on that day. Hamas leaders are outspoken about their ideology. One of their political leaders even said, "We need to cleanse Palestine from the filth of the Jews." It was expressed chillingly. In the words of senior Hamas member Ghazi Hamed to Lebanese television on October 24, using the Hamas term for the October 7 attack, "The Al-Aqsa flowed," he says. "This just the first time, and there will be a second, a third, and a fourth." Later in this interview, Hamed is asked, Does that mean the annihilation of Israel?
Madame Ben-Ari, please conclude.
Yes, please, 2 minutes. I'm speaking
No,
to you
please,
for my
you're
bottle
already
of
2 minutes.
2 minutes?
No, please
for
finish
you.
now. Please finish.
Please. Yes,
No,
of course,
because
the answer.
you know we have to be fair to other colleagues. There are a lot of them who want to speak.
Okay, can I have
So
1
please,
minute?
No,
to
just
close?
conclude, please. Please conclude.
1 minute to close?
No, just conclude.
Okay. I can read you from my papers and tell you what Israel was being for. No democratic state in the world will understand the situation. We are the children, the elderly, 135 people still in Gaza, in a tunnel, without water, in the darkness, shouting for your help. Be in the right side of history. Stand with Israel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In the debate, I call next Mr. Hegazi. The floor is yours, Mr. Hegazi.
Dankeschön, Frau Präsidentin. Mehr als 100 Tage Krieg, Massaker, Terror und Vernichtung ruinieren weiterhin das Leben der Menschen im Gazastreifen. Im Namen der palästinensischen Nationalrat und palästinensischen Parlament verurteilen wir Angriffe auf Zivilisten, sowohl auf israelische als auch auf palästinensische Seite. Der Angriffe mit Tausende unschuldige Zivilisten im Gaza ist ungerecht und grausam. Der Krieg gegen den Menschen in Gaza ruft Hass hervor und behindert den Friedensprozess in der Stadt. Es ist unbedingt erforderlich, einen Waffenstillstand durchzusetzen, angemessen Lösungen zu finden und sofort mit der Rettung der Bewohner von Gazastreifen beginnen, die heute von Epidemien, Hungernoten und dem durchgehenden Tod bedroht sind. Also, wir haben bis jetzt 25.000 Tote. Wir haben von denen 7.000 Frauen, 10.000 Kinder, 120 Journalisten, 4.000 Kranken starben aufgrund Mangel Medikamente. Mehr als 60.000 weiteren Verletzte und Verwundete. 8.000 Menschen werden vermisst unter den Gebäuden, Trümmern. 1,1 Millionen Bewohner wurden vertrieben. Also in Westbank seit 7. Oktober 6.195 sind verhaftet in israelischen Knast. Und das in Westbank auch 50 Journalisten, die sind auch festgenommen. Von Toten 560 Todesfälle, 111 Kinder, 4 Frauen von denen. Also, Gazastreifen ist unbewohnbar. Westbank, es ist von israelischen Siedlungen schon geschluckt worden. Wo ist die Stadt? Wir haben immer gehört, 2 Staaten. Eine Stadt Palästina, eine Stadt Israel. Okay, Israel ist hier, aber wo ist die Stadt Palästina? Westbank ist geschluckt von Siedlungen und Gazastreifen schon bombardiert und vernichtet. Ist keine, nicht mehr. Jerusalem ist sowieso die sagen immer, das Hauptstadt von Israel. Also, das haben wir nicht erwartet von der Welt und von Demokratie und von Freiheit. Die sollen mit diesen Leuten, die ihre Länder schon seit 75 Jahren kämpfen, um unser Land mit Friedensprozessen zu haben. Und das war das letzte Oslo-Abkommen, die immer von Ministerpräsident Netanyahu dagegen war. Obwohl vorher wurde schon akzeptiert und wir hatten auch gut zusammen. Wir waren als Palästinenser nie gegen Juden als Religion. Wir hatten vorher zusammengelebt und wir haben das akzeptiert. Wir sind gegen Besatzung. Das ist alles. Wo ist unser Land? Es ist alles geschluckt worden. Also, es lebe die Freiheit. Es lebe die Freiheit. Es lebe die Demokratie, es lebe die Gerechtigkeit und Menschenrechte und Gerechtigkeit auch. Wo sind Menschenrechte, wo sind Kinderrechte, wo sind die Frauenrechte in Palästina? Das mussten wir wissen. Vielen Dank.
Thank you, Mr. Hagazi. We will proceed with Mr. Corlatean from Romania Socialist Party. The floor is yours.
Colleagues, from the beginning I will say that I will support the adoption of the report and the draft resolution. In the current complicated context, I can appreciate the hard work of the rapporteur for a balanced and fair report. A few concrete elements. October 7, first of all, and the horrible crimes committed by the Hamas terrorists. This was the first episode, and some people try to forget this important fact. And I strongly condemned the killings of the innocent people, killing Israelis because they are Jews. This is more than terrorists. This is Nazis. The same terrorists that killed also on October 7 Romanian nationals living in Israel and kidnapping Romanian nationals with double citizens, but also the same terrorists from Hamas that blocked using the weapons and threatening the Romanian nationals, especially women and their Palestinian husbands and the mixed families and the children in Gaza when they tried to get out from the northern part of Gaza. The dramatic situation of the hostages. I also want to ask the immediate release, starting with the babies. The right of self-defense of Israel based on the UN Charter. I want to mention the fact that only Putin and only people with radical attitudes can deny this UN Charter fundamental right. A clear distinction between the Palestinian people and the Palestinian legitimate cause for a state and Hamas. Always, for some of us, the National Palestinian Authority and for some of us, our comrades from Fatah within the Socialist International have been considered our partners bilaterally, but also for the peace process. We recognized in Romania in 1988 bilaterally Palestine, and a full-fledged Palestinian ambassador is functioning starting from 1989 in Bucharest, and we all the time cooperated with our Palestinian partners. The horrible humanitarian crisis in Gaza. I want to be clear. Every life of the innocent people which is lost in Gaza, in West Bank, but also in Israel, it's a huge loss. It's a drama for the humankind. But here I want to make two comments. First, the humanitarian aid, which is a must, and also my country contributed substantially and will contribute once again in the near future. But we don't want Hamas to distribute and to profit. The humanitarian aid is for the Palestinian people, not for the terrorists. And secondly, immediate ceasefire will have no meaning without dismantling Hamas military capabilities and of some other terrorist organizations. And I want to put a rhetorical question maybe, how to avoid innocent human lives losses when Hamas is using as human shields its own people. I condemn also the profound negative role of Iran, but also of Russia in the region. And I also condemn the dangerous rising of the anti-Semitism once again in Europe. On peace process, which is the only choice, a sustainable peace process for two-state solutions that we support can be facilitated by relaunching of the normalization process between Israel and and some other Arab countries, and with Saudi Arabia, this is essential. But don't forget that the moment of Hamas attack inspired by Iran came exactly for blocking directly the process between Israel and Saudi Arabia that could have facilitated the relaunching of a real peace process, so it was against the interests of its own Palestinian people. It's important, and this should be a priority, to avoid the escalation in the region. And last but not least, let's use in the future, today it's complicated, the Council of Europe and PACE platform for political dialogue, especially the special subcommittee on Middle East in the future. That will be once again the need for bridges of communication and dialogue, not for extreme attitudes which will not help at all. So I will support the adoption of the report and the resolution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Monsieur Milon from France. Monsieur Milon, la parole est à vous.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Mes chers collègues, tout en remerciant notre collègue Piero Fassino pour la qualité de son rapport et de son analyse, je veux redire combien nous avons été choqués par l'attaque terroriste menée par le Hamas contre Israël le 7 octobre dernier. Les actes barbares qui ont été commis sont insoutenables et j'ai une pensée toute particulière pour les otages toujours retenus par le Hamas, dont certains sont des binationaux. Et leur libération immédiate et inconditionnelle est évidemment nécessaire. Le président du Sénat français s'est rendu en Israël et en Palestine fin décembre avec l'ensemble des présidents des groupes politiques du Sénat pour marquer notre solidarité et essayer de contribuer au dialogue en vue de retrouver le chemin de la paix. Israël a évidemment le droit de se défendre et de riposter face à une attaque existentielle dont la finalité même est son éradication. Nous comprenons totalement l'émotion du peuple israélien ainsi que la mobilisation du gouvernement face à ces attaques. Mais on ne peut rester sourd et aveugle face aux destructions et aux cortèges de morts à Gaza. Le poids de vies innocentes est le même que l'on soit israélien ou palestinien. Qu'Israël combatte les combattants du Hamas avec une farouche détermination est une chose. Que l'on tue un tel nombre de civils pour atteindre en est une autre. Le rapport de notre collègue Fassino mentionne près de 24 000 morts et plus de 60 000 blessés du côté palestinien, ainsi que le déplacement interne de 85% de la population de Gaza. La question de la proportionnalité de la réponse israélienne est clairement posée. La guerre est toujours hideuse, mais elle ne doit pas nous détourner de notre humanité. Je soutiens l'appel à un cessez-le-feu immédiat et prolongé afin de permettre un accès total, rapide, sûr et sans entrave à la population de Gaza. Le manque d'abri, de nourriture, d'eau, de médicaments et de soins médicaux a des conséquences dramatiques. On ne peut pas laisser cette situation perdurer. Je forme le vœu que cette résolution contribue à faire évoluer les positions du gouvernement israélien, sans quoi il risque de voir les opinions publiques de ses alliés se retourner contre Israël. J'ajoute que malgré les difficultés et l'urgence du moment, la responsabilité supérieure du gouvernement israélien est de prévoir l'après et préparer les conditions de la paix et de la sécurité à long terme. C'est indispensable pour l'avenir d'Israël et cela passera nécessairement, à mon sens, par la reconnaissance de deux États. Je vous remercie.
Merci. I call next Mr. Wichel from Sweden. The microphone, please. The microphone on. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. Our rapporteur, Mr. Fassino, and our Political Affairs Committee are to be commended on the concise report they have prepared on recent developments in the Middle East, with a focus on the war between the Hamas terrorist group and the State of Israel. I agree fully with the report's analysis of recent developments, such as Hamas' deceitful attack on October 7th in breach of the official ceasefire then in force and the subsequent brutal slaughter of over 1,000 Israeli civilians. Israel's response to annihilate the Hamas forces in the streets and tunnels in Gaza is not just only understandable, but also fully justified. One of the core obligations of a country is to defend its citizens when attacked. With this in mind, it's important to minimize the number of civilian casualties, which have now reached alarmingly high levels. It is worth remembering that the responsibility for the tragedy we now witness primarily lies with the Palestinian terrorists. Clearly, Hamas and its like-minded partners completely ignores the security and well-being of its population. We all need to do what we can to change this, for the sake of all innocent civilians who now suffer. Dear colleagues, the war in Gaza goes on and is likely to do so for at least weeks to come. This conflict does not only affect Gaza, but also the rest of the world. As an example of how this conflict might expand even further, we see how the related missile attacks by the Iran-backed Houthis in northern Yemen are threatening world trade and world peace. In conclusion, I want to stress the importance that each and every one of us do our utmost to support a peaceful development in this region. The one key to do so is for Hamas to put down their arms, free the hostages, and surrender. If it wasn't for these terrorists, there would be no war and there would be no casualties. Hamas chose to start a vicious war. They have a power to end it for the good of their own people. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Ms. O'Loughlin from Ireland, ALDE. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. When I was a young girl, one of the first books that I have a very strong memory of and left a lasting impact on me was Annie Frank's diary. I couldn't understand or comprehend such cruelty, such a horrific example of man's inhumanity to man. Years later, I visited Dachau, Auschwitz and Belsen, and again I was horrified as to what happened. It was explained by everybody I knew, by people saying, we didn't know. The world didn't know what was happening. We're ashamed and we're embarrassed now. Years later, I spent time in a kibbutz close to the Gaza border and met survivors of the Holocaust. And I apologized to them and said the world didn't know. We didn't know what was happening. Lest we forget is something that we hear every single year. And here in the Council of Europe, we commemorate the Holocaust and we say that, lest we forget, basically saying, on our watch, nothing like this will ever happen again. But it is happening. It's happening in Gaza. Gaza is a Holocaust by another name. This time we cannot say we did not know. Every time we open our newspapers, our phones, our television screens, we are bearing witness to the absolute slaughter that is happening in Palestine. What Hamas did on the 7th of October was barbaric, appalling, horrific, and I utterly condemn their actions. But as Gandhi said, an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind. In 3 months, 25,000 Palestinians have been killed. 75% of these women and children. 85% of people displaced. 7,000 missing and 7,000 injured. There is a lack of clean water, inadequate sanitation, collapse of the whole health system, causing a public health disaster. We are a human rights organisation with a moral and a legal obligation to protect human rights. We should be shouting with our loudest voice and with all of our might. Children, by virtue of accident of their birth, are being denied the most fundamental human right of all, the right to life. Their mothers, if they get a space in a hospital bed, have to leave after 1 hour because there is such a shortage of beds. We must fight with every fibre of our being for an immediate ceasefire, to step up humanitarian aid and to start on a two-state solution. I stand with all of the victims, and I particularly stand with Palestine. Just one final point that I'd like to make. This is the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world that we're dealing with, and I think it's regrettable that we only have a 2-hour slot here during our plenary. I understand from my colleague Deputy Robert Troy, who is a member of the Political Affairs Committee, that many more wish to speak on this, and many amendments that would have strengthened this resolution were voted down. We need more time, and we need to support those innocent victims in Palestine. Gurv Mahagat.
Thank you. I give the floor to Mr. Kiljunen, Socialist Party from Finland.
Madam President, I'm more than pleased that I can follow Fiona for her excellent presentation. But unfortunately, I am not 100% sure where I am by listening to some of the statements today. We're supposed to be in the leading human rights organization of Europe, actually in the whole world. We are so many times said human rights are universal, and we defend human rights everywhere. War crimes are war crimes. There are no excuses when war crimes are committed. Crime against humanity, we condemn that everywhere, irrespective of who does it. True, 7th of October last year, Israeli people met brutal aggression by Hamas. We condemn that as an act of terror, no question of that one. This is very clear that we demand release of all hostages. Israel does have the right to defend her people in their homeland. But, Madam Chair, we can ask Palestinians, where is their homeland? In 1948, 80% of Palestinian people were deported from their homelands, and they don't have since have the right to return back to their homes. Since that period, we have seen retaliation after retaliation, aggression after aggression. In Finland, we have saying, make revenge, dig two graves. Gaza today, US President Biden has accused Israeli army to use indiscriminate bombing. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres condemned heartbreaking and utterly unacceptable killings of civilians in Gaza. Quote, Israeli military operations have spread massive destruction and killed civilians on a scale unprecedented during my time as a Secretary General of the United Nations. Quote ended. That was a statement by Guterres. There are some who are saying that this intense bloodshed in 100 days in Gaza today is most massive civilian killing since the Second World War in whole mankind. Accusation we have heard today. Hamas terrorists use human shield. If that's the case, we condemn it. But remember, friends, I have read the history of the world. Freedom fighters hide among people everywhere. Why? Because they represent the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kiljunen. And I give the word to Mr. Lopatka from Austria.
Dear President, dear colleagues, on October 7th, which coincided with a Jewish holiday, thousands of armed Hamas terrorists invaded Israel through the land, the air, and the sea. Simultaneously, Hamas terrorists fired thousands of rockets from Gaza towards Israeli civilian territory across the entire country. They broke into civilian homes and carried out a series of murderous atrocities and barbaric attacks, and over 1,200 civilians were murdered on this day. Over 200 were abducted, and more than 130 are still being held hostage, also an Austrian citizen. Yes, Politics is driven on compromise. But there are fundamental questions where compromise is not possible. There cannot be a compromise with terrorists, with enemies of our open society, with enemies of democracy. They must be fought uncompromisingly in order to prevent another October 7th, a day with burned babies and beheaded people. It can only mean, for me, zero tolerance with intolerant, zero tolerance with terrorists. They hate Jews, not only in Israel. They hate Jews worldwide, and they hate our open and free society. So, for me also, this 1.7 million displaced civilians in Gaza are victims of Hamas too. And it is the right of self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter that Israel has to defend its people, of course, in accordance with international humanitarian law. And I think we have to do everything, of course, that the humanitarian situation in Gaza gives the people the possibility to receive aid. And there is need in the Gaza Strip. I see it. But we have, on the other side, to allow Israel to fight these terrorists. Our Austrian Nobel Prize winner for literature, Elfriede Jelinek, wrote some days ago, "With this crime, Hamas has destroyed itself once and for all." I hope she is right, and there's no future for Hamas terrorists. At the same time, and I want to close with this, I think we, our assembly, as the international community, have to support this two-state solution despite all backlashes since the Camp David summit in 2000. It remains for me the only way to ensure peace for Israeli and Palestinian people and for the whole region. And peace must be the aim.
Thank you, Mr. Lopatka. And now I would like to give the floor to Madam Gören Bölük from Turkey. Madam, you have the floor.
Cher Président, chers collègues, l'humanité tout entière est témoin de ce qui est peut-être le pire crime contre l'humanité de l'histoire. Nous utilisons parfois cette phrase pour la Première Guerre mondiale, parfois pour Hiroshima et la plupart du temps pour la Seconde Guerre mondiale. Cependant, dans le monde d'aujourd'hui, 25 295 Palestiniens, dont 11 000 enfants, 7 250 femmes ont été brutalement massacrées, sous le couvert d'opérations antiterror en l'espace de 108 jours seulement. Et le massacre se poursuit de manière persistante avec plus de 63 000 blessés. Depuis le début, l'administration israélienne commet de graves crimes contre l'humanité sous les yeux du monde entier. Avec les mots de Philippe Lazzarini, commissaire général de l'Office de secours des Nations Unies, le monde a été le témoin vivant du massacre d'innocents par la machine à tuer israélienne. Israël a utilisé des bombes au phosphore interdites contre des civils à Gaza. L'ont prouvé des photographies prises par des agences internationales. Plus de 53 000 tonnes de bombes, soit l'équivalent de 4,5 bombes atomiques, ont été larguées sur Gaza. En fait, la bombe atomique larguée sur Hiroshima pendant la Seconde Guerre mondiale équivaut à seulement 12 000 tonnes utilisées par Israël. En plus de ce bombardement intensif, l'administration israélienne empêche l'accès à l'électricité, au carburant, à l'eau, à la nourriture, aux médicaments et aux fournitures médicales à Gaza. Elle a bombardé des hôpitaux, des écoles, des camps et des lieux de culte où s'abritaient des civils. En outre, Israël a demandé aux civils de Gaza de se rendre à Rafah, à la frontière égyptienne, pour leur sécurité. Près de 2 millions de personnes ont été déplacées de force et ensuite, Israël les a bombardées. Il a fait exploser des installations de l'ONU et pris pour cible des ambulances sans pitié. Il a effacé la mémoire de Gaza en détruisant toutes les archives et tous les journaux. Il a abattu des femmes enceintes portant des drapeaux blancs. Je répète, il a abattu des femmes enceintes portant des drapeaux blancs et versé de la terre sur elles. Il a utilisé les micros d'une mosquée pour se moquer des morts palestiniens. Pire encore, cette situation sinistre est le résultat des actions d'un pays auquel nous avons accordé le statut d'observateur en raison de sa volonté de reconnaître nos valeurs fondamentales, mais qui agit en totale contradiction avec celle-ci. Cette atrocité commise par Israël n'est pas restée sans réponse dans l'opinion publique mondiale. Malheureusement, certains gouvernements ont tenté d'empêcher ces manifestations pacifiques et légales en les qualifiant d'antisémites. Pourtant, des slogans tels que « non au génocide », « il y a des enfants à Gaza » ou « cessez le feu maintenant » ne contiennent aucun discours antisémite. Alors que les personnes de conscience se ressemblent contre Israël et que certains appellent au retrait de son statut d'observateur au sein de notre Assemblée, nous aurions dû tenir Israël pour responsable de la tragédie qu'il a causée et condamner toutes ces actions qui ont conduit à cette tragédie. Nous devrions suivre de près l'affaire contre Israël devant la Cour internationale de justice qui constitue une étape concrète vers la responsabilisation d'Israël. Je rends hommage à tous les diplomates, au personnel médical, aux membres de la presse, aux enfants, aux femmes et à tous les civils qui ont été tués pendant cette guerre. Enfin, je souhaite voir notre Assemblée dans laquelle les victimes de la guerre ne sont pas évaluées selon leur religion ou leur nationalité. Merci.
Thank you, Madam Beluk. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Armen Gevorgyan from Armenia.
Madam Chair, unfortunately, violence has become one of the main mechanisms for implementing the plans of not only terrorist groups and authoritarian states, but also democratic governments. As the UN, Council of Europe, OSCE, and other international organizations lose their relevance and influence, unacceptable forms of solidarity between authoritarianism and democracy appear, which are often based on a union of arms and oil. Such solidarity is limiting the right of many nations to self-determination and promoting direct aggression against other states. There is an expert opinion, for example, that Ilham Aliyev's decision to resolve disputes with Armenia by war rather than diplomacy was due to the fact that Israeli companies agreed to sell him top-shelf military technologies. According to open sources, between 2016 and 2020, just before the start of the 44-day war in Nagorno-Karabakh, Israel accounted for almost 70% of Azerbaijan's major arms imports. Israel probably justifies this weapons trade with Azerbaijan on the basis of arms for energy calculations or Azerbaijan's willingness to cooperate on anti-Iran policy. Therefore, Israeli politicians, as the representatives of a democratic state, must answer a very important question. Is there a difference between Hamas and Azerbaijan when it comes to genocidal intent, because the only difference between them is the target of their policy? Moreover, the Israel's political elites must ensure peaceful coexistence of the indigenous inhabitants of these holy lands today. Otherwise, there is no explanation of the ongoing attempts to deprive the Armenian Church of its historical heritage in Old Jerusalem. Dear colleagues, we must cool the heat of patience in the Middle East as soon as possible. If this does not happen, the situation will also get out of control in the South Caucasus, where the Turkish-Azerbaijani coalition is just waiting for more regional chaos for a new aggression against Armenia. I strongly condemned the Hamas attack on Israel and want the signals coming from Europe to the region to be clear, convincing, and without the smack of double standards for all parties. Otherwise, expansions of the war zone is inevitable according to the logic, what Israel can do, we can too. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gevorgyan. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Frides Pierre Alain, Switzerland. You have the floor.
Merci, Madame la Vice-présidente. Mesdames, Messieurs, chers collègues, j'aimerais remercier le rapporteur pour son rapport. Je partage l'essentiel de ses remarques et propositions. Ce qui s'est passé en Israël le 7 octobre est inacceptable et la barbarie dont le Hamas s'est rendu coupable, intolérable. Et la riposte d'Israël, compréhensible. Mais dans le même temps, nous devons bien reconnaître que le prix payé par la population civile de Gaza en termes de morts innocentes et de souffrances est également inacceptable. L'ONU vient de qualifier les 100 jours de guerre de tache sur notre humanité commune. J'aimerais ici étendre le débat et replacer ce qui s'est passé dans un contexte historique, encore une fois sans vouloir excuser les atteintes aux droits fondamentaux perpétrées ces derniers mois de part et d'autre. Je comparerai Gaza à une marmite sous pression, prête à exploser de longue date, une prison à ciel ouvert avec plus de 2 millions de personnes entassées dans cette petite bande de terre suite aux aléas d'un conflit récurrent datant de 1948. Et Gaza, c'est non seulement le pouvoir radicalisé du Hamas, mais c'est aussi une jeunesse sans perspective, sans avenir, sans travail, une population pleine de rancœur qui survit sous perfusion de l'aide internationale dans des conditions de vie déplorables, une pauvreté extrême et un accès limité à l'eau. Il était facile dans ce contexte, de fait toléré par la communauté internationale, dans ce conflit gelé sans issue, de permettre au Hamas de prendre le pouvoir et de prospérer avec un discours de haine et de revanche. Ce dossier a été oublié par la communauté internationale et la droitisation progressive au fil des années des gouvernements successifs en Israël, en parallèle à la radicalisation du Hamas, n'a pas permis d'amorcer une détente et une ébauche de solutions à cette situation explosive. Après une longue et minutieuse préparation de son dessein criminel, le Hamas est passé à l'attaque le 7 octobre. La marmite a explosé, avec des scènes d'horreur et des crimes inqualifiables. Et Israël a riposté avec les grands moyens pour détruire et éradiquer les forces militaires du Hamas, ainsi que libérer plus de 200 otages. Après plus de 3 mois de conflit acharné, les bâtiments et les infrastructures de Gaza sont pour l'essentiel détruits. La population a dû fuir vers le sud de l'enclave, sans possibilité d'entrer en Égypte. Les conditions de vie sont devenues inhumaines et surtout ont compté, selon le Hamas, quelques 25 000 victimes civiles, 3 fois plus de blessés, dont énormément d'enfants, des victimes innocentes qui paient le prix fort. 25 000 morts à Gaza, un chiffre bien entendu non vérifiable, mais cela représenterait plus d'un habitant sur 100 qui serait décédé. C'est comme si en Suisse on avait tué près de 100 000 personnes d'un coup, ou des millions et des millions d'Européens. Nous savons toutes et tous que le prix du sang appelle le sang. Les victimes épargnées aujourd'hui, poussées par un irrépressible sentiment de vengeance, vont devenir autant de bombes à retardement futur pour le peuple israélien et la communauté internationale. Il faut, chers collègues, que ces drames s'arrêtent, qu'un cessez-le-feu interrompe cette fuite en avant mortifère. Il faut également que les otages soient libérés sans délai. J'en appelle à la raison, à l'apaisement, au temps de l'aide humanitaire, avec en parallèle un temps politique essentiel sous la protection d'une force internationale d'interposition. Pour moi, la seule option crédible réside dans la solution à 2 États, en espérant qu'il ne soit pas trop tard.
Thank you. And now I will give the floor to Mr. Stamatis Georgios from Greece.
Ευχαριστώ, κυρία Πρόεδρε. Σε λίγες μέρες θα έχουμε την επέτειο από την απελευθέρωση του Auschwitz. Τι ήταν αυτό που έγινε στο Auschwitz? Οι Ναζί σκότωσαν ανθρώπους επειδή ήταν γκέι, επειδή ήταν Ρωμά, επειδή ήταν Εβραίοι. Αυτό έκαναν οι τρομοκράτες της Χαμάς. Σκότωσαν Εβραίους επειδή ήταν Εβραίοι. Το παράδοξο της ιστορίας είναι ότι αυτούς που σκότωσαν οι τρομοκράτες ήταν άνθρωποι που πιστεύαν στην ειρήνη, πιστεύαν στη δημοκρατία. Οι Χαμάς δεν είναι επαναστάτες, είναι τρομοκράτες. Και σωστά είπε ο συνάδελφος, ο κύριος Λοπάτκα, το ερώτημα είναι τι θα διαλέξουμε, τρομοκρατία ή δημοκρατία. Και εμείς πρέπει να επιλέξουμε τη δημοκρατία, γιατί η επόμενη μέρα μπορεί να είναι για μας, αν δεν αντιδράσουμε. Υπάρχει ένα χρηματοκιβώτιο στο Τελ Αβίβ που έχει 5 ονόματα. Είναι η οικογένεια Σιμαντόφ. Ο Γιώταναν, ο πατέρας, η Ταμάρ, η μητέρα, η Σάχαρ και Αλμέρ, δίδυμες, 6 ετών και ο Μέρ 4 ετών. Εκεί γράφει ότι δολοφονήθηκαν γιατί αυτοί οι άνθρωποι, αυτή η οικογένεια κάηκαν ζωντανοί. Κάηκαν ζωντανοί γιατί πιστεύαν στη δημοκρατία. Χαιρετίζουμε την έκθεση που είναι πάνω στις αρχές του Συμβουλίου της Ευρώπης και πρέπει το Συμβούλιο της Ευρώπης, αφού η διεθνής κοινότητα δεν έχει καταφέρει να βρει μια λύση, να αναλάβει αυτή την πρωτοβουλία. Γιατί θα πρέπει να αποφασίσουμε ότι δεν πρέπει να αφήσουμε στους τρομοκράτες της Χαμάς, στους δικτάτορες όπως είναι ο Πούτιν, ο κάθε ένας που θέλει να κάνει ό,τι θέλει στο γείτονά του, να μπορεί να επεμβαίνει και η διεθνής κοινότητα να μην επεμβαίνει. Κύριοι συνάδελφοι, τα όπλα της Χαμάς από πού έρχονται, ποιος τους τα δίνει και τα λεφτά που έχει δώσει η διεθνής κοινότητα στη Χαμάς, πού πήγανε. Πήγανε για νοσοκομεία, πήγανε για όπλα, πήγανε για να κάνουν τρομοκρατία, όχι για να απελευθερώσουν το λαό και να φτιάξουν παλαιστινιακό κράτος. Κάναν για να εξολοθρεύσουν τους Εβραίους. Εμείς πρέπει να στηρίξουμε τα δύο κράτη, να στηρίξουμε το ανθρωπιστικό δίκαιο και η ανθρωπιστική βοήθεια που θα πρέπει να φτάσει στους Παλαιστινίους και όχι στους τρομοκράτες της Χαμάς. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Thank you. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Corbyn from United Kingdom. Mr. Corbyn, you have the floor.
Thank you. And we thank the authors of this report for putting it forward to us, even though some of us have some concerns about much of the content of it. The events on October the 7th were unbelievably awful and appalling, and our hearts have to go out to all the families and loved ones of those that either disappeared or were killed on that day. Whoever the person is that's been killed, there is grief amongst others. A mother grieves for a lost son or a lost daughter, whatever their religion, whatever their nationality. And the events since October the 7th of the bombardment of Gaza and the continued destruction of all life there have not brought anybody back, but have created more bitterness and more hatred. And there has to be a way forward. After October the 7th, the General Secretary of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, said this didn't all come from nowhere and drew to attention the 75 years of occupation, the numbers of Palestinian refugees that are in camps in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Syria and other places, and of course the occupation of the West Bank and the continued settlement policy. These issues have to be addressed if to ensure there is a long-term sustainable peace within the region. If there isn't a sustainable peace, so far as the Palestinian people are concerned, then this will lead to other conflicts that it already is, in the case of Yemen and the growing militarization of the whole region. Our job surely has to be to search for peace, and you achieve that peace through searching for justice. I was at the International Court of Justice 2 weeks ago to listen to the South African application, where they made an application under the Genocide Convention. And they pointed out that the government of Israel, particularly Prime Minister Netanyahu, has made statements about the destruction of Gaza, destruction of all life in Gaza, and the expulsion of the population of Gaza. After October the 7th, they were told to move south to a place of safety. They moved south to what they believed to be a place of safety and were promptly bombed. And there are now 1 million people corralled around the Rafah crossing, desperate for support, desperate for aid, and desperate for some degree of hope. And so we look forward to what the International Court of Justice is going to say about this. We also have to recognise that the number of people that have lost their lives is horrendous. 25,000 known to be dead, probably 8,000 to 10,000 bodies will be found under the rubble, and many now dying of starvation, of dehydration, of diarrhea, and all those wholly preventable conditions. So surely us, as the Council of Europe, the custodians of the European Convention on Human Rights, a body that represents people all over this continent, can do one good thing today and simply say there must be an unconditional ceasefire now so that aid can get in to support the people of Palestine, the people of Gaza, but above all, we can then achieve a long-term peace, which means justice for the people of Palestine and an end to the occupation.
Thank you. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Zsolt Nemet from Hungary. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mrs. President. I would like to underline, dear colleagues, that we are here because of the Hamas terrorist attack on the 7th of October against Israel. Yesterday in the committee we have discussed the word barbarism. There was an amendment which suggested that barbarism should be deleted. And the answer of the committee was no. We don't delete it because it was barbarism. I would say the most barbaric terror attack in the recent modern history, what happened on the 7th of October in Israel. Yesterday, there was a statement, an official statement by Hamas about the events on the 7th of October. They said there were mistakes. That is the Hamas statement about the 7th of October. After 2 months, I think we are quite far away from a common interpretation, and unfortunately, this debate reflects the same. Allow me to suggest a few ideas for the common denominator. Number one, the right of Israel to self-defense is a point of departure. Secondly, I would suggest that we should make clear that there is no freedom of assembly in democracies for anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli propaganda. That is what the Hungarian government has followed and decided to pursue. 3, the hostages must be freed immediately and unconditionally. The 5 Hungarian hostages, unfortunately, some of them died. One is still a hostage. The humanitarian assistance, yes. To Gaza, the humanitarian assistance must be guaranteed. But at the same time, we need to prevent the internationalization of the conflict with our utmost energy, be it Iran or Russia or the Houthis. And the Palestinian-Israeli relations, yes, it needs a long-lasting solution, but unfortunately, exactly this attack was to prevent the process of the Abraham Accords. And we need to look to the future. Probably it will not be easy, but dear colleagues, yes, either terrorism or democracy. And terrorism cannot play a role in the long-lasting solution. It must not play a role in the long-lasting solution. Hamas terrorist strategy is a dead-end street. Thank you very much.
Thank you. As it is 6 p.m., I now declare that voting is closed for the election of the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights and for 3 judges to the European Court of Human Rights. Please, could the tellers for each political group go to the designated room to attend the counting. The result will be announced, if possible, before the close of today's sitting. And now I give the floor to Mr. Milatovic George from Cyprus. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear colleagues, in the 13 years I have been at the pace, there have been moments of disappointment due to the prevalence of double standards. On the other hand, there have also been many moments of satisfaction,
as the PACE stood up for its core values and principles, demonstrating in practice its resolve and determination as a pioneer organization in the field of human rights protection. However, in the case of the atrocities committed by Israel, the stance of the Council of Europe and the Assembly in particular has been the most disappointing experience thus far. Even though we correctly condemned Hamas' terrorist attack on Israel on the 7th of October, as it also targeted innocent civilians, we have for 105 days turned a blind eye to the tragic situation of the Palestinians in Gaza. Not only did this organization not condemn the situation, regrettably, it has not even voiced criticism, nor prompted the consideration of an alternative reaction on the part of Israel. Even though the UN has documented the following realities, no statement was made as regards the massive murder of thousands of civilians, the majority of whom were women and children, including also 75 journalists, UN staff, as well as medical and paramedical personnel. This organization remained silent, whilst Israel made Gaza uninhabitable by destroying housing units and infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, refugee camps, churches and mosques, in blatant violation of international humanitarian law. This organization ignored the relevant statements issued by Israeli government officials, including those of Netanyahu, some calling even for the use of nuclear bombs against the Palestinians, and Israel's relevant acts of genocide, as we also ignored the deprivation of Palestinians' access to water, food, electricity, fuel and medical aid, leading them to starvation. This organization did not feel the need to react on the massive displacement of almost 90% of Gaza's population and the acts of ethnic cleansing that have created a worse Nakba than the previous one. Our silence does not honor this organization, but on the contrary, undermines its credibility. However, this resolution, if relevant amendments are supported, give us the opportunity to speak the truth and to call a spade a spade. To condemn not only the events of October 7, but also those that preceded and followed them. To call for an immediate, unconditional and permanent ceasefire. To call for the immediate release of all Hamas hostages and Palestinian political detainees in Israeli prisons, including children and women. To call on the Israeli authorities to end the policies of occupation and apartheid, to prevent settler violence and refrain from building new settlements or extend old ones, and for carrying out home demolitions, forced evictions and confiscation of land in the occupied territories. To finally call for the resumption of peace negotiations based on a two-state solution in accordance with the relevant UN resolutions that will lead us to a just and lasting peace for all the peoples in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Boaz Bismuth from Israel.
There you go. Okay. Madam President, I must admit I came to Israel with my speech, but when I hear some of your speeches, too many unfortunately, I'll speak to you directly, because honestly, I come to a very respectful platform, and I think that today, the debate of today, when I hear your speeches, is a disgrace for your platform, and you're staining the place where you're sitting. And I'll tell you why. For me, you know, the Holocaust that you're going to commemorate tomorrow, you know, the 27th, it will be the International Day of the Holocaust of the Shoah. And you know that day is a specific day, and the Shoah is specific. There were other atrocities, horrors, genocide in the world. Yet, Holocaust had its particularity. Never do we like to do the parallel with the Holocaust, yet my president has done it after the 7th of October. And you know why? Because people violated my sovereignty, entered my homes, entered kibbutz, entered little towns, and took, pick up, did not kill, because kill is too easy. They slaughter, they rape, they hijack, they mutilate. Why? Because you're Jewish. What has happened 8 years ago? You do it because you're Jewish. That's exactly what you do. But there's a big difference. 80 years ago, what did a Jew do when he was raped, mutilated, assassinated, killed? What did he do? He ran away. He fled. What does he do today? He defends himself. But my God, the Jew cannot defend himself because immediately all of you will speak of crimes, world crimes. My God, I mean, how come? You must understand one thing. I hear many of you here, and you speak in this platform, honorable again, but you know what drives me? I mean, yes, drives me crazy. I hear zero compassion. Now, forget my 136 hostages. Okay, you're very far. You don't think of them. But let me talk to you about one specific one. And you know why I say one? There is one that when he was hijacked, he was 9 months old. A week ago, he celebrated his 1 year old. So I would expect you, the ones who now give their speeches, to show a little bit of compassion to the Jew, but you will not do it. You know what? It's even more disgusting, because you will go and you will see how in this international era or arena, you will see a country like South Africa accusing us. So I want to tell you something, Jakov, genocide. There is something I want you to understand. Hamas terrorists are the new Nazis. And if you do not understand that, you understood nothing. But there is one thing after those speeches that I hear, those disgrace, those shameful speeches I hear. I did not come here to Strasbourg to speak to you in order to justify myself. I came as an accuser. And my God, when I was a kid, I asked my parents, 8 years ago when you had the Holocaust, where were all those people, where they were killing Jews? Why didn't they say anything? And I come here to Strasbourg, and I understand the child I was asking the questions, because of some of you are in your speeches. My God, thank God, some Jews, you are not their neighbors. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bismuth. And now I call Mr. Armagan Kandan from Cyprus. You have the floor.
Dear colleagues, yet again we are witnessing a humanitarian disaster. I would like to start by condemning the attack by Hamas towards Israeli civilians. Nothing can justify that kind of terrorism. At the same time, Israeli response towards civilians is not acceptable either. The attacks towards Palestinians have been resulting in shocking number of civilian casualties every day. Killing of individuals is not acceptable. Each day, hundreds of lives are getting lost, and the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza is getting worse. We need an immediate ceasefire to end civilian bloodshed and ensure humanitarian aid access to Gaza. Israeli hostages also should be released as soon as possible. We as PACE members need to take tangible steps to stop this bloodshed and inhuman cruelty. I have a lot of Palestinian relatives, and I also have a lot of Israeli friends. So we should do our best to stop this now. We as Turkish Cypriots suffered humanitarian crisis in Cyprus between 1963 and 1974 when we were forced to live in ghettos. We lived under similar conditions for 11 years. We can understand the insecurity and fear of death both sides feeling at the moment. This is not acceptable. Civilian Palestinians are suffering, waiting at what moment to be killed by the bombs. This is the biggest humanitarian crisis, and we all failed. We are all failing once again. Immediate ceasefire is needed, and diplomatic efforts should be established immediately to facilitate the negotiations, to restart for the two-state solution in that region. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the last speaker for this debate is Mr. Damian Catier from Switzerland. Mr. Damian, you have the floor.
Merci Madame la Présidente. Évidemment que ce débat se passe avec beaucoup d'émotion et c'est compréhensible. Mais je crois au contraire, Monsieur Bismuth, que le rapport que nous livre le rapporteur, M. Fassino, fait l'honneur de cette Assemblée. Parce qu'il nous livre un rapport extrêmement équilibré, qui regarde les problèmes des deux côtés de manière extrêmement objective. Et c'est important que nous puissions en débattre, certes avec émotion parfois, mais aussi en regardant la réalité de la situation. Et vous savez, cette Assemblée a déjà débattu 3 fois de cette situation. Elle l'a fait au mois d'octobre dans cette salle. Je crois que vous n'étiez pas dans ce débat, et ce n'est évidemment pas un reproche. Tous les groupes politiques, avec des mots extrêmement forts, ont condamné les atrocités, la barbarie du 7 octobre. Et il était nécessaire de le faire, il était juste de le faire. Et cette émotion et cette condamnation, elle est encore là, dans ces débats. Nous l'avons fait ensuite à Vaduz, lors de l'Assemblée, de la réunion de la commission permanente, avec la même sévérité contre les attaques ignobles du Hamas, contre la population civile israélienne, et avec tout ce qui a été décrit, ces attaques, ces meurtres, ces mutilations, ces viols qui sont des atrocités pour lesquelles nous ne trouvons pas des mots assez forts pour des condamnations. Et c'est d'ailleurs pour ça que le Parlement suisse débattra prochainement de l'interdiction du Hamas comme organisation terroriste, et c'est une nécessité de le faire. Et oui, Israël a le droit de se défendre. Et oui, Israël a le droit d'être en sécurité, a le droit de voir ses enfants, ses hommes et ses femmes libérés, encore 136 otages qui se trouvent actuellement dans les mains du Hamas, et ils doivent être libérés immédiatement, absolument. Mais néanmoins, il est important que nous discutions de la situation concrète à Gaza. Et lorsque j'écoutais la semaine passée des représentants d'organisations internationales humanitaires nous dire à quel point la situation est catastrophique sur place, eh bien nous attendons aussi d'Israël qu'il respecte ses obligations de droit international et qu'il mène ses offensives de la manière la plus ciblée et de la manière la plus respectueuse possible de la population civile. Tout est dans le mot de la proportionnalité qui figure évidemment dans l'esprit et dans le texte des conventions de Genève que nous devons tous appliquer. Et c'est bien de cela que nous discutons aujourd'hui, de l'accès humanitaire pour éviter cette situation catastrophique. Et je crois que c'est vraiment important que tout le monde le comprenne. Bien sûr qu'il faut cibler les cibles militaires du Hamas et il faut le rendre hors d'état de nuire, mais il faut faire de telle manière que ce soit acceptable et proportionné, que ce soit acceptable pour la population civile. Et je crois profondément que c'est dans l'intérêt de la paix dans la région et donc aussi dans l'intérêt d'Israël, parce que sinon il n'y aura pas de compréhension dans l'opinion publique mondiale, parce que sinon elle ne respecte pas ses obligations et parce que sinon il sera impossible de construire une paix durable. Donc c'est à cela que notre Assemblée doit appeler aujourd'hui. Je trouve que le rapport de M. Fassino le fait extrêmement bien. C'est pour ça qu'il a reçu un soutien très large hier en commission et j'espère qu'il aura un soutien très large de cette Assemblée avec quelques amendements qui d'ailleurs précisent les responsabilités, en particulier de l'Iran dans la région, qui ont été acceptés à l'unanimité et que j'ai soutenu. C'est de ça que nous pouvons devoir débattre ici en toute sérénité, malgré l'émotion. Vous savez, les douleurs ne s'opposent pas, elles s'additionnent, et il faut vraiment que nous cherchions ici la meilleure solution pour une paix durable et pour un respect du droit international humanitaire.
Thank you, Mr. Katia. And now I must interrupt the list of speakers. The speeches of members on the speakers list who have been present during the debate but have not been able to speak may be given to the table office for publication in the official report. I remind colleagues that typewritten text must be submitted electronically no later than 4 hours after the list of speakers is interrupted. I call Mr. Fassino, rapporteur, to reply to the debate. You have 3 minutes.
Sì, grazie Presidente. Ma io credo che il dibattito dimostra quanto questa crisi scuota le coscienze di ciascuno di noi. E credo che sia naturale che sia così, di fronte al massacro dei cittadini ebrei del 7 ottobre, di fronte al numero enorme di vittime civili in Palestina. È del tutto evidente che ci siano sentimenti, emozioni. La politica non prescinde mai dai sentimenti e dalle emozioni. Però io penso anche che bisogna riuscire a guardare le cose senza avere nessuna forma di passività o di cinismo con razionalità. Allora, io non credo che si possa, per esempio, dire, come ho sentito in alcuni interventi, condanniamo Hamas, ma gli israeliani, come se le due cose fossero sullo stesso piano, perché non sono sullo stesso piano. Le brutalità che Hamas ha commesso sono tali da non poter essere comparate con l'offensiva militare israeliana. Poi quell'offensiva militare ha fatto molte vittime, ne ha fatte troppe. Questo ci porta a criticare Netanyahu e il suo governo per le scelte che ha fatto? Sì, ma non c'è comparazione tra Hamas e Israele. Mi dispiace, questo bisogna averlo chiaro, perché se stabiliamo una comparazione, noi cambiamo la lettura di quel massacro, così come non c'è nessuna giustificazione